film and video production. Up to this point, I had used it to create some amateur movies with friends from school, which were mainly just short clips of us walking through the woods and attempting to look frightened.
Hi everybody, pt6 Queen here. I'm back with the animation.
Not that I blame them in all honesty. Once I knew my parents had both left for work in the morning, I sprung up out of bed and grabbed my camcorder, not even realized that I hadn't taken the time to get dressed first. So I merely slipped on a t-shirt along with my pajama pants and my socks before beginning to head downstairs. I made sure to give every room above the basement a quick look through in order to make sure that I was the only one in the house at the time. After which I stood at the basement door, putting my hand on the knob and taking a deep breath. It wasn't that I was having second thoughts necessarily, but I considered things that could potentially go wrong before ultimately deciding the risk was worth it to prove my claims. So I opened the door and took my first steps down the creaky stairs, reaching over to my right and hitting the switch to turn the basement light on. Our basement itself wasn't something to write home about. It was what you would usually expect. A cold, brown-painted concrete floor and wall rectangular expanse with wood support and insulation lining the ceiling. Old dusty washing machines, piles of both dirty and freshly cleaned clothes in an assortment of different baskets. Cobwebs lining every corner of the room, with centipedes worming their way underneath the cracks in the walls. I made it to the bottom of the stairs before taking a left and heading into the more recreational side of the basement. Although the only thing that truly made it recreational was a simple lawn chair and an old coffee table, one that I'm sure hadn't been used in the past several months. Nonetheless, I soon made it to the thing that I was talking about, the wall that was opposite the lawn chair and coffee table. Call me crazy because in a minute, I'm sure you're going to be asking what could be so wrong with the simple wall. Well, this wall, it was slightly darker than the rest, even those immediately to both its right and left. It had this shadow that was eternally cast onto it, even when there wasn't a light source or object to create one. And sometimes it flickered, as if it were a light bulb. I've seen it happen before, and I saw it taking place yet again right before my eyes. The first few times that it happened, I could have sworn it was just my imagination, but now it was clear that my imagination had nothing to do with it. I thought that was the strangest part of this entire ordeal. I had come down to look at it before and thought the out-of-the-ordinary phenomena would end there, until I got the balls to touch it. I mainly wanted to see if there was something that I was missing, that maybe it had something to do with the paint, or I just had something really wrong with my eyes. But that was me trying to rationalize something I didn't understand, because yesterday I had grabbed a broomstick and shoved it right up against the wall, expecting some paint to chip or some material to crumble. But no, instead, the broomstick simply went through the wall. I'm not really sure how to describe it in an intellectual or a detailed manner. It is as simple and as absurd as it sounds. My broomstick went through a solid concrete wall. I even walked forward with it in my hands at the time, and it continued going deeper in the wall, feeling no obstacles or objects stopping it. To make it clear, there were no holes, no cracks or breaches large enough to fit the width of the broomstick within. It was flat and smooth, and yet the broomstick sunk further in as if it were lodged in quicksand. And then, after some careful but clearly not enough consideration, I put my hand up to the wall, and once my elbow had disappeared, I pulled back. There was no pain, no extreme temperature, no bugs. Someone or something waiting to grab, bite, or claw me. It was just shocking, in a way that made me only want to learn more. Maybe I just never noticed it before, but I could have sworn the wall had looked much more normal when we had first moved in. Not that I had ever spent very much time in the basement. Maybe I had no idea what I was talking about. Maybe I just hadn't truly paid attention enough to notice any changes. But last time it was only my arm, and this time I was going to put my entire body inside. I wanted to step through, to see what was on the other side of the wall. There was a part of me that even considered this to be some sort of hologram projection, and that somehow was less insane than what it actually ended up being. But nonetheless, I'll always look back and see this as one of the most ill-informed acts, but the curiosity in me simply couldn't be contained. I needed answers. So with my camcorder still in hand, I approached the wall, reaching out my hand yet again to make sure that it was still passing through. And as you can infer, the result was rather unsurprising. So after I took a deep breath and looked behind my shoulder at the rest of my basement, I stepped forward slowly, my natural instincts telling me that the wall was still solid despite me vanishing further into it. But suddenly I felt like I was being jerked forward and falling. The actual feeling of falling only lasted for less than half a second, before I hit the ground again with a thud. My camcorder fell out of my hand as I collided with what I assumed was another floor or wall. The texture under me felt rugged like a carpet with a bit of moisture. I rubbed my head and opened my eyes, thinking that I had fallen into a section of our house that I wasn't supposed to discover. But no, that wasn't it at all. What I saw when I looked up didn't make any sense. It didn't even seem possible. Part of me had wondered if I had accidentally inhaled a hallucinogen or something. In front of me was what I could only describe as a large, messily segmented and built set of rooms, hallways, and corridors. All the walls were covered in this truly awful, bright yellow wallpaper that looked as if a small child had picked it out. It wasn't easy in the eyes in the slightest. I got myself to my feet, looking over to my right and seeing my camcorder on the ground, not broken and still recording. I leaned over and picked it up, putting it back in my hand before immediately turning around to get a better bearing of my surroundings. How did I get here? Why was I here? And what was this place? There were a million thoughts running through my head, and even though it was the last thing that I wanted to do, I remained calm. That's what you always do in situations like this. You must remain calm. Panicking helps nothing and no one. I was quiet for the most part in this strange place, the only sound being a slight electric buzzing noise. It had an irritating hum to it, and I couldn't help but look up to find the origin of it. Seeing a white tiled ceiling with poorly placed fluorescent lights running along it, most of which had possessed a subtle flicker. "Hello?" I called out. "Is anyone there?" No response. So I ran up to one of the walls and started pushing on it. The moist carpet squelched a bit beneath my feet as I heaved myself forward in an attempt to pass through the wall as I had earlier, but to no avail. I turned and dashed over to the wall behind me, pushing and shoving myself up against it. But it, like the other, was solid. I backed away from the wall, coming to the conclusion that I needed to save my energy if I was going to get out of here anytime soon. And while I imagined many ways this could get worse, it didn't make it any easier to accept the fact that I was trapped in this almost otherworldly sub-basement. So I started by wandering down the nearest corridor to my left. It seemed to be around 200 feet long, with dozens of intersecting halls connected to it on both the right and left walls. That same horrendous yellow wallpaper was consistent throughout. Even the humming and buzzing of the lights above followed me as I walked down the hallway. The fact that it was the only noise present in this building besides the squelching of moist carpet as I walked only further drove me up the wall. It was maddening in the most mundane yet most unsettling way possible. It's crazy how much humans rely on sound for comfort, because I had only been in this strange expanse for about a minute and it had already felt like hours. "Hello?" I yelled once again, hoping for even a semblance of a response. "Is anyone here? Can you hear me?" Like the previous attempt, there was nothing in response. Not a sound or sign of another human being. My breathing practically became twice as loud to make up for the dreadful silence. I soon encountered the end of the narrow corridor. I wandered into what appeared to be a much larger rectangular expanse. The basic design and layout were still the same, with multiple other corridors converging in the middle, kind of like an intersection. The lights flickered more heavily in the middle of the intersection, the humming and buzzing becoming almost unbearable. I don't know who approved the funding for this place, but they had to have been out of their freaking minds. I didn't quite been able to come to a decision about which direction I should have gone at the intersection. All I know is that I wanted to get as far away as possible from that dang buzzing. I scoped out each hallway from where I stood with my eyes, with the one on the left catching my attention the most. Not because I was genuinely curious, but because it actually had something distinct going for it. And by distinct, I meant that it was dimmer than the other three, with only one of the fluorescent lights in the entire visible length of it. But despite the poor lighting, I noticed something about halfway down its length. On the ground was what looked to be a piece of paper laid out on the ground, just a single sheet that contained text written in red ink. And being the only distinguishable proof of life or the presence of other human beings in this place, I began to creep down the corridor and approach it, looking back over my shoulder with the undeniable feeling of being watched as I did so. I reached down, picking up the note as I made it over, only to make the unnerving discovery that the red ink was not ink at all. It was blood. I don't know how long I've been here or how much longer I've got left. I'm scared and it feels like it's been days and I haven't been able to find a way out. All I did was come home from work, throw myself into bed, and then I was here. I found this paper laying around in here, along with someone's car keys that were laying around and had blood on them. I haven't seen another person since I got here, but I'm not alone here. There's something else lurking in these halls, and it isn't any man or woman. I gotta keep quiet and stay low, or whatever got the guy who had these keys belonged to, it's gonna come for me as well. And whoever finds this, if anybody finds this, keep quiet, stay low, and God help you if that thing hears you. I felt my heart sink in my stomach as I turned to look behind me, only to find nothing but the slight flickering of the lights yet again. But I was more than on edge. As crazy as it sounded, I believed every word that was written here. This wasn't some practical joke or prank. Even the most elaborate of pranksters didn't have the resources for something like this. I can't count the number of times that I've seen a horror movie where something that's obviously not a joke is treated like one by the protagonist. And guess what? Well, they end up dead. There was no name or other information on the note, and since I was made aware that there might be something bloodthirsty lurking in here with me, the last thing that I needed to do was carry around this note and have the smell of blood on me. So I left it, dropping it right at my feet, and I began heading further down the corridor into a cylinder-shaped room. It was still more of the same as far as design and architecture went. I took another deep breath, preparing to head down the right corridor of the cylinder room, but before I could even move an inch, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. The rest of me stayed right where I was by extension. The sound in question was a loud, ear-shattering screech that didn't sound all that far from behind me. I stood there completely terrified while my previous confidence quickly had drained. I could only hope that I wasn't seen by whatever it was, and I wasn't, not yet anyway. Once I had mustered up the courage to finally turn around, I didn't see anything behind me. It was still the same yellow walls and moist carpet, and yet it somehow became even more sinister than before. And that thing, was it what killed the person who wrote the note? Whatever this being was, I could now hear it getting closer. Its footsteps were quick and frantic, so I picked up the pace a little bit. My slow march turned into a brisk stroll. I couldn't help but feel like my heart was going to explode out of my chest from the dread the situation had filled me with. I made a left turn, and then another before booking it down into a wide corridor before making a right. This place really was a nonsensical maze. The architecture made absolutely no sense, but I refused to let this yellow wasteland become my grave. The creature shrieked again, but this time the tone was slightly changed, now sounding a bit more celebratory and more triumphant, as if it had accomplished something that it extracted joy from. It was only once I heard what came next did I understand why. "No, no, no, no," came the desperate, horrified screams of what sounded like an adult man who knew that he was about to meet a truly awful fate. I couldn't pinpoint exactly which hallway or room this chaos was coming from. All I know is that it wasn't more than 30 to 40 feet away. Regardless, I wasn't intending to play hero against some creature that I hadn't even seen the appearance of. "Stop! Stop! No!" The man began to cry out, only to be cut off by his own shriek, accompanied by the sound of bone snapping and flesh tearing. His cries soon became gurgled, only lasting a few more seconds before he was drowned out by the sound of aggressive snarling and growling. At this point, I was sprinting, tears of both stress and fear forming in my eyes. I quickly raised my fingers up in order to wipe them away and keep them from blurring my vision as I ran. I eventually found a tight, almost closet-sized space at the end of one of the hallways. I didn't hesitate to slip inside and get myself out of sight as soon as humanly possible. Once in, I headed to the corner furthest from the opening, sat down and put my knees to my chest before shoving my face in my arms and taking surprising care to not be too loud, lest I want to draw that thing over and then really have something to cry about. I could only think about how I really might die here, that I'll be the next victim of whatever that monster is. If there were more people that were alive and trapped in this, whatever this place is, then I have to try and find them and make a plan to get out of here once and for all. I let myself stare into the darkness of this crevice as I sat there with the illusion of safety, while still in more terror than ever. I only just now realized that I dropped my camcorder in all the chaos of reacting and running, but most of me honestly didn't care. Proving a point wasn't worth it the moment I fell into this place. I should have left the wall alone. I should have just minded my own business and not poked my nose where it shouldn't have been. As helpless as I felt, I know my idiotic actions had a part to play in the predicament that I found myself in. But I was here now and I had to grapple with the reality of the less intelligent moves that I made. If I was going to get out of here alive, the last thing I needed to do was to sit here and mentally check out. I needed to be on my toes and alert. So once I had mustered the strength to stand back up, I did just that. I was still no superhero or brave soldier, but I was someone who wanted to survive. Someone who wanted to live to share a story I'm sure most would not believe. I quietly walked over to where I had entered the small den, turning to peek my head through the skinny opening into the larger hallway. But I immediately froze when I heard footsteps that weren't heavy or slow, but abundant and quick, as if whatever was moving on far more than just two limbs. They were coming from down the corridor to my left. I could make out the fact that whatever it was going to turn the corner at any second. I retreated back into the den and got as far away from the opening as was physically possible, but my morbid curiosity as to whatever I was trapped in this maze with, it couldn't be contained. It just had brutally killed someone, so any sort of negotiating or attempting to reason with it was out of the question. All I could do was sit here and wait as it began to walk down the hallway, approaching closer and closer to the den. Once again, its footsteps were soft, yet horrendously abundant. It sounded more like scurrying. It had this almost tapping-like rhythm that made my skin crawl, like a spider the size of a dog running down a hallway. I held my breath as it approached, only letting myself exhale when absolutely necessary. I didn't dare poke my head out the entrance or attempt to get a direct look at it, but the shape of its shadow on the wall behind the den opening did more than enough to make sure that I never forget this experience for the rest of my life. The lowest part of its body looked to be composed of at least a dozen thin but long limbs that all moved in unison with one another in a twisted, uncanny manner, like a centipede that had been sloppily stitched together. Above that set of horrific legs was a long rectangular frame with dozens more bent and thin limbs protruding from each side of it. I couldn't even tell if this thing had a head. Definitely not one that I could make out with the shadow. Who in their right mind would keep a monstrosity like this in here? Was it locked up? Did it kill the people keeping it contained and get out? Is that why this place is abandoned? Even if I did have answers to all those questions, it still doesn't explain the fact that it seems like I'm far from the only average person to end up trapped in here. It really was something out of a child's nightmare. Anyone's nightmare, in all honesty. It stopped only feet in front of the entrance to my den. I prayed to every god that I could think of, hoping that it wouldn't detect or sense me. The creature, whatever it was, let out a low growl, a far departure from the pitch of sounds it was making previously. I could feel it vibrate the wall that my back was against as I held my breath. Even if I wanted to make a sound, I couldn't. No noise could escape me. My terror was busy holding it in. It seemed to turn side to side as if in the middle of looking for something, but the creature didn't move in either of those directions, instead choosing to continue to move forward and to turn the corner down another hall, allowing me to live for another day, at least for the time being. I made an escape while I had the chance, busting out of the entrance to the den and immediately making a mad dash for the left in the lightest footsteps possible. Nearly right after turning the corner, I spotted my camcorder on the floor at the far end of the hallway. It had been smashed with dozens of broken up pieces all over the area surrounding it. All the footage and proof that I had were gone. I wasn't aware at the time if there was some way to extract or salvage anything off of it. I could only wonder how mad my friend would be when I tell him all those short films that we created using the thing were toast. But there wasn't much time to mourn the loss of my hard work, so I kept moving. When I made it back to the cylinder room this time, I chose a different path to go down. Last thing I needed was to go anywhere besides the total opposite direction of where that thing was headed. I was now more than alert than ever as I trekked through this nonsensical expanse, aware that there is far worse waiting for me in these walls than simple starvation or severe loneliness as a result of isolation. In all honesty, I've always loved my privacy and being away from others, but not like this. There was more of the same everywhere that I went. Yellow walls, white ceiling, and smelly moist carpet. The hum buzz of the lights became a background song at a certain point. I had just accepted the reality that it wasn't going to stop anytime soon. Regardless, I took 3 left turns and then 3 right turns before heading straight for what felt like nearly a quarter of a mile, then taking another left. I thought that I was surely leaving the creature in the dust, and that it would never find me in this endless maze. But as I was dashing down one of the corridors, I noticed something at the end that caught my eye. Something that I thought might be my ticket out of here. My saving grace, and so I slowed down, let myself take in a few deep breaths, and tried to get my heartbeat back to a more reasonable speed. I then looked back over at what had my attention, making out what looked to be 2 thin, long objects protruding out from the ceiling. The distance made it difficult for me to make out details in the shapes, but the colors consisted of a dark blue for the majority of these objects' lengths, with them ending in a light brown towards the bottom. "Please," I whispered out loud, "please let this be it." My predictions were generally optimistic. I thought that I'd be able to climb my way out of these walls and be free. But as I got closer, so did the reality of what these so-called objects actually were. It had got to a point where I was only around 7 or 8 footsteps away from these things, and as I looked up, my bottom jaw hung ajar. They were legs, human legs, which had protruded from a section of the ceiling where the tile had been removed, although from the looks of it, it was more like violently torn and or busted off. I had morbidly assumed the rest of the corpse was laying along the other tiles within the ceiling. How did I know that it was a corpse? Well, it definitely wasn't just the pair of
When you need a morning snack with 2 grams of carbs and 1 gram of sugar that's keto-friendly, it's time for Ratio.
jeans and old boots the legs were covered in, but a foul stench as well. A stench that was irrefutably rot and decay, one that I had only ever experienced when walking near dead animals in the woods and near my house. Except here, it had been cranked up to 11. I threw my left hand over my nose, fighting the urge to lose my lunch as I looked up in horror. There I was, standing just several feet underneath a pile of rotting meat that was once a fellow human being. a fate that could only have just as easily become mine if I didn't get lucky. But what could have possibly done this? Did the creature chasing me possess the ability to scale surfaces? Its anatomy seems to suggest that it might be the case, and if it didn't, then that means there was something else that I had to watch out for in this maze, the thought of which did nothing to help me feel any better. Eventually, the vomit that had risen its way into my throat had overpowered my efforts to keep it inside. I took my hand away, opened my mouth, and all over the wall it went, while the smell of rot continued pounding its way into my nostrils. I had to turn back, to get away from it as soon as possible. But just as I had regathered myself enough to start running and finding a new way to go, the sound of many rapid footsteps in succession made me quickly rethink my actions. I slammed the brakes on harder than I ever had before, as I heard them coming from around the corner closest to my left. That thing, it was coming back for me, and I'm sure the smell of the body directly above me didn't help much either. I stood there, frozen like the terrified moron that I was. Truthfully, there was a part of me that wanted to give up and accept my fate, to let this, whatever this was, kill me and get it over and done with. But that quickly dissipated once I saw one of that thing's legs begin to wrap around the corner at the end of the hallway that I was looking at. It was a grotesque, black, almost asphalt-like color. A bit of blood staining the tip that also stained the wallpaper. My fight, or more precisely, flight instincts kicked into gear. I didn't bother sticking around to get a better look at what I knew was a truly horrifying appearance. I turned and ran once more, reaching the opposite end of the hallway in mere seconds, before immediately making a sharp left turn into another. I heard the creature let out a chilling screech as it gave chase, those many legs stampeding along the carpet and the walls as it pursued me relentlessly. Any effort to be subtle or quiet was now in vain. I made a few more random turns both left and right, hoping to confuse the beast, but my efforts seemed to be pointless, as I was still within its line of sight despite what I had done to get out of it. I huffed and wheezed as I looked for anything that could take me to a higher or lower elevation, stairs, an elevator, or ladder, because I was more than sure that it would fall victim to fatigue long before my pursuer did. After a few more twists and turns, endlessly trying to make myself as elusive as possible, I began to slow down as my exhales became quicker. My face went red and sweat began to drench my face. A stitch in my side began to form as well. I knew that I was doomed if I didn't find anything soon. I truly thought that things couldn't have gotten any worse than the terrifying sequence in which I was currently trapped. But this strange dimension had an excellent way of proving me wrong. Without looking, I made another left as I heard the creature shriek yet again behind me, alerting me that it was still in hot pursuit. I tried my best to keep my pace as I dashed down the hallway that I had just turned into, looking at the floor for a few seconds as my muscles ached and cried out for mercy. Even the adrenaline couldn't keep me going forever. When I looked up, however, I was met with the sight of a dead end. No turns or other corridors. There was no way to go but the way that I came. I was only several feet in front of the wall that cut me off. I tried to turn and make a mad dash back the way that I came, only for the creature to leap out from around the corner and cut me off, forcing me to stumble backward and abandon my decision as I fell right on my butt. Its centipede-like legs wrapped around the wall once again as they reached forward. The creature then begins to move its body from around the corner, revealing more of its appalling appearance to me as I crawled backward in utter disgust. Saying that it looked like a mutant centipede would be an insult to such a creature. I had trouble believing even God himself could conjure up such a monstrosity. The entity's skin was a dark, near pitch-black tone of color, with jagged streaks of dirty white patterns running along it that looked more like scars than any sort of natural anatomical patterns. When the beast stood to attention, it had to be well over 7 feet, absolutely dwarfing me as if I were a toddler in the presence of a grown man. The entire perimeter of its actual body had those thin limbs protruding from it, all of them moving in unison with each other. Once again, a few of them still possessed blood on their tips, who I'm assuming belonged to the man that I heard die screaming earlier on. The body of the creature was a sharp rectangular shape. It mostly lacked features save for the giant gaping hole towards the top, which I had concluded to be its mouth. One without any teeth, just a pitch black, voidous hole. This thing knew that it had me cornered, each end of its mouth contorted in a fashion as if it were trying to smile at me, but it just about lacked the necessary muscle structure to do so. Regardless, it wanted me to know that I was trapped, at its mercy for it to kill me in a gruesome, agonizing way. I was going to become its plaything and its food. I still had some self-preservation left over, despite the rational part of my brain telling me that there was nothing that I could do. But I managed to get to my feet nonetheless, beginning to back up as the creature slowly lurched forward, dozens of its limbs all moving in tandem with each other. "Please," I announced softly, holding my hands out in front of my face as I continued backing up while my legs trembled. And just as I was expecting myself to hit the wall that was behind me, I felt my body suddenly jerk backward, as if I had just been yanked by something powerful. I yelped as my back impacted what felt like a hard carpet surface, and suddenly things weren't nearly as bright. I pulled my hands away from my face, revealing an entirely new environment around me. A library, just a plain old library. The walls were just a plain light brown color, the ceiling was tiled, and there were fluorescent lights, but they weren't buzzing or flickering. The carpet itself didn't feel moist either, just like regular everyday carpet that was actually maintained. I coughed for a few seconds trying to comprehend what had just occurred, in a fury of confusion, but it clicked soon enough. I had passed through the wall, the same way that I had passed through the one that had me end up in that yellow-colored death trap in the first place. But doesn't that mean the creature could follow me? That single question made me quickly tense my muscles as I prepared to throw myself up to my feet, only to be stopped halfway by the comforting sound of an older woman's voice. "Are you okay, young man?" I turned, seeing several different people around the library with their eyes on me, some in lounge chairs reading books, some at the desk in front of computers, and some standing next to shelves with books in hand. I almost caught a glimpse of the woman who had spoken, who I had guessed correctly to be on the older side, with long gray hair and wrinkly skin, dressed in a button shirt and khakis with a pair of thin glasses on. "What? This is home, right?" I said, letting out a few more coughs. Everybody shared glances with each other, more than likely thinking that I was in some sort of state of delusion. The older woman informed me that she hadn't seen me enter the library, that everyone had heard a sudden thud and there I was, sprawled out on the floor and coughing, so she came over to see if I was okay. The police were contacted to come and take me home. I obliged, wanting to make everything as easy as possible after what I had just gone through. But during everything that transpired, the library staff making the call, my parents talking with the officers, all I could think about was that place and that thing. You see, what made it even more confusing was the fact that I had entered that place several hours before my parents were supposed to arrive home. Yet I could have sworn my whole ordeal there lasted no longer than an hour, and I was never knocked unconscious or asleep at any point. Nonetheless, I'm now writing this to try and make sense of what had happened to me, but I don't think that'll ever truly happen. I'm sure no one will really believe my story, but it helps to get it out there anyway, at least for my own sanity. I have my first appointment with my new therapist next week, and not by choice either. Therapy's never really been my thing, but I guess that's what happens when you ramble to your parents about getting stuck in a different dimension and running from mutant creatures with impossible anatomy. Not that I'll even attempt to tell her any of that, although I'm sure my parents might do it for me when first meeting her. But if I've learned anything from all this, it's that I'll never, and I mean never, go near that wall again.
Put your hustle on pause for now. Nabilo, the refreshing taste of arrival.
West Bengal, India has its fair share of allegedly haunted places, but perhaps none are as creepy or as intriguing as the Aliyah ghost lights. In the swampy marshes of West Bengal, there have been many sightings of these lights called Aliyah or jack-o'-lantern. They're described to be a flickering ball of light that emerges usually in the marshy regions of West Bengal and Bangladesh, and they've been attributed to being the cause of death of many fishermen. The fishermen community of the area have often spotted these unexplainable lights, and many believe that some of the fishermen were so transfixed after seeing the Aliyah light that they followed it and drowned. It's also believed by many in the area that these lights are the spirits of dead fishermen who lost their lives fishing in the marshes. These lights at times confuse the fishermen, causing them to fall in the water and drown, but also at other times, they may help guide them and prevent them from getting into danger. At least that's what locals believe. Aliyah ghost lights are not just limited to West Bengal though. They have been spotted in various places around the world, and these lights have long been associated with the paranormal or spirits. Some good spirits, some bad spirits. It's said that once you follow one of these lights, they'll flicker and diminish in size until they disappear, often causing people to panic and get lost. People have seen these lights all around the world in graveyards, swamps, and boglands, and they have been referred to as many different names. Anaya Carr from Siliguri was on the phone with her husband who was on a solo fishing trip, and when he had mentioned seeing a bright light glimmering across the marsh, he stopped replying, though the call didn't end right away. Anaya would keep saying her husband's name into the phone until it sounded like the phone was dropped, and then the call abruptly ended. Her husband was never seen again. In 2014, taxi drivers in Ibadan, Nigeria were starting to disappear, and while there was no outward evidence of any sort of foul play at first, people started to become suspicious when more and more people would disappear and mysterious-looking strangers would be lurking the area. Police were notified of the disappearances, but reportedly were uncooperative, refusing to investigate further and saying that the men had likely just run off. As the disappearances continued in the area, there was still no official response until a motorcyclist riding down a highway claimed that he had heard some crying out for help from the forest. On March 22, 2014, police finally went about investigating the forest, where they would stumble across a literal house of horrors. There, tucked away in the trees, was a seemingly abandoned building from which emanated a vile stench. Upon entering the building, they were met with countless decomposed human corpses, most of which had been bound with chains. As the search of the place continued, police began turning up other human remains in the surrounding area, many of them having been butchered and missing limbs, some of them even still bound with chains. There were also numerous human remains found scattered in the surrounding woods, stuffed within bushes, in the nooks of trees, or dumped into holes in the ground or into caves. The corpses and remains were in various states of decomposition, many of them missing limbs or internal organs. In total, over 20 decomposed human bodies and hundreds of human skulls were found in the forest, and there was a separate building full of only personal belongings of the victims, including licenses, clothing, and even children's toys. 15 people were rescued who were chained up in captivity, all severely malnourished. When police interviewed them, in most cases they could not identify the people who had taken them, but they described that they had been kidnapped, tortured, and kept in shackles with once-a-week feedings. However, a few claimed that the men who kidnapped them had been government officials, or at least were posing as them. The answers as to what exactly happened here have not been made completely clear, and it's unknown who took these people or where they went. And while some arrests were made, no one has been officially charged with any of it. On January 2, 2000, Zeb Wayne Quinn went missing in Asheville, North Carolina. Zeb was 18 years old and working at a local Walmart in the electronics section when he disappeared after finishing his shift. At around 9 p.m., he had plans to travel a moderate distance with his coworker Robert Jason Owens to buy a new car. Zeb met Robert in the Walmart parking lot before they drove separately to look at the vehicle. The two men were seen on surveillance footage at a nearby gas station at approximately 9:15 p.m. purchasing sodas at a convenience store. According to Robert, after leaving the gas station, Zeb signaled for him to pull over by flashing his headlights. Zeb told him that he had received a page and needed to return the call. After he returned from using a payphone, Robert described Zeb as frantic and nervous. Zeb told him that he needed to cancel their plans to view the car, and he eventually sped off, rear-ending Robert's truck in the process. Hours later, Robert was treated at a hospital for fractured ribs and a head injury that he claimed was due to a second car accident that same evening. No accident report was ever filed with police. The following afternoon, Zeb's mother Denise filed a missing persons report. 2 days after he was last seen, a man claiming to be Zeb placed a phone call to the Walmart where he worked. The man told Zeb's coworker that he would not be coming to work due to coming down with a fever, but the coworker recognized that the voice was not Zeb's. The phone call was placed back to a Volvo plant where Robert worked. When questioned, Robert admitted to making the phone call, claiming that he was doing Zeb a favor after he called and asked Robert to call in sick for him. During police investigations, a woman named Misty Taylor was interviewed, as she and Zeb had become romantically involved in the weeks prior to his disappearance, and he had told friends and family that he had been threatened by her abusive boyfriend, Wesley Smith, after he discovered that the two of them had been speaking. On January 6, 2000, Zeb's mom received a phone call from a former classmate of her son, who happened to be a co-worker at the Asheville hospital where both were nurses, who told her that she had seen his car in the parking lot of a barbecue restaurant next to the hospital. Police examined the car, which had been left with its headlights on, but there was also a pair of lips and an exclamation mark drawn on the car's back windshield in lipstick, and a live puppy was found inside. A plastic hotel keycard was also discovered in the vehicle, but police couldn't find the source hotel. There was also a jacket that didn't belong to Zeb in the car. Police collected forensic evidence from the car, but uncovered no new leads. Zeb's mother believes that the car was placed there by somebody that knew that his family worked and lived nearby, intending that one of them would find it. A couple later called police to report that they had seen Zeb's car being driven in downtown Asheville before it was parked at the restaurant, and assisted police in producing a composite image of the person driving the car. Police later noted that the sketch looked identical to Misty Taylor. Robert Jason Owens was arrested in 2017 for the murder of Zeb. However, in his plea agreement in July of 2022, just last month, Robert's story went that his uncle Gene, who died in 2017, knew Misty Taylor's aggressive boyfriend and was asked to do something to keep Zeb away from her, and Robert said his uncle's remedy was murder, though he said that he played no part and only witnessed it. The judge accepted Robert's plea and sentenced him to 150 to 189 months in prison, which will be served concurrent to a 60 to 75-year sentence he's currently serving for the murder of a couple in 2015, which is an entirely different story of its own. Regarding Zeb's murder, no one can really know for sure what actually happened.
Dear Mainland, aloha. My brother and I like tailgating too, yeah? Good friends, good grinds, and plenty of cold Kona beer.
When's the game start?
What game? One life, right? Mahalo.
On July 13, 2011, Rebecca Zahau was found hanging at the Spreckles Mansion in Coronado, California, and she was pronounced dead by first responders called to the residence. Rebecca's body was found nude, bound, and gagged. Her death occurred 2 days after 6-year-old Max Shackney, the son of her boyfriend Jonas Shackney, had fallen from the staircase of the mansion and was held in a hospital in critical condition.
This took place in 1989 when I was around 7 years old, living in a section of Denver called Edgewater. My parents always said that this was a dangerous place, but they never really acted in a way to make me suspicious. They had me walk to the elementary school that I attended, and I was friends with all the neighborhood kids in this particular apartment complex. Well, I had been until one odd day. One of the neighbor kids came out. He was around 10 or 11, when the rest of us were between 6 and 8 at the time. I was 7. He came out with a couple of cups of liquid while a lot of us were playing in this courtyard that all the front yards of the apartments would open up to face. I don't remember the conversation, but he was insistent that we drank from his cups, which he insisted were just sugar water. I had played with the kid before, so I felt that I could trust him, and no one told me that bad guys could be other kids, especially the ones that I played with. So I took one of the cups, I went to take a sip, but as soon as I brought the cup to my face, I knew there was something wrong. The cup had a very strong floral scent. I asked him what was in it, and he again insisted it was just sugar water. I brought it to my lips just to taste it, still not trusting it. It was very bitter, and the floral scent was stronger. It turned out the kid had mixed air freshener in with water and tried to get us all to drink it. I gave the cup back to him and went into where I lived to tell my parents about the weird thing that had just happened. They confronted his mother, who really didn't seem to give a crap, but called the kid out to appease my parents. He had admitted what he had done in his justification. Well, air freshener is mostly just orange juice anyway. My parents and I moved out of that area of town and into a much nicer one, though more lonely as there weren't other kids around to play with. But I got to live in a creepy house by a creepy abandoned church at that point that still played bells on Sundays, so it all worked out. We were 16, an age where you feel invincible. It was summer and school was out, and my friend and I, who lived in the same apartment complex, decided to go to the mall and kill time as any other underage teenager would do. I don't remember much about that day other than our walk home from the mall. It must have been around 9 when we left, since that is the time the mall closes. Our apartment building was 2 miles away from the mall, so of course we walked. It was hot out, and we both knew that once we got home there would be nothing to do, so we opted to walk home. We enjoyed the conversation and the passing of time. Our town wasn't extremely dangerous. I mean, yeah, there were muggings and theft, but it wasn't as bad as other cities in our county, where unsolved murders were commonplace. So we walked those 2 miles oblivious to any potential threats. We were a mile in when we passed an intersection. Shortly thereafter, 3 males had walked out of the opposite street and began walking behind us. I didn't think much of it. It's summer, they were young, it's hot out. No reason to be suspicious. My friend, however, was unnerved. Hey, yeah, those guys behind us, what about them? I'm pretty sure they're following us. What? No, I don't think so, you're just being paranoid. As soon as I had said that, one of the men had started whistling at us. I turned around. What you got in the bag? And we had shopping bags from the mall. Nothing, leave us alone, my friend retorted. I remember being upset. Why would she even respond to them? At this point, I was super nervous, and it turns out my friend was right. Call it intuition. We begin walking faster now that we sense danger, and as we quicken our pace, so do the men. They know that we're onto them. We near a plaza with a Del Taco, and as we enter the parking lot, the men disperse. One is directly behind us, and the other 2 are on our sides. I turn around. They all whip out freaking metal baseball bats out of nowhere. At this point, I turn to my friend and we hightail it to the Del Taco, not bothering to turn around. Thank God it wasn't too late, or they'd be closed and we would have nowhere to hide. As soon as we enter the Del Taco, we look out of the windows and witness all men jump into a Cadillac Escalade that was parked. Were they only trying to scare us? Why the baseball bats and why the car? What the heck is going on? We watch as the car drives away. That doesn't quell our fear. We spend about 10 minutes in the restaurant deciding what to do next. Do I call my dad to come pick us up? Or do we walk the half-mile back home? We didn't want to worry our parents, and so, for some incomprehensible reason, we decided to walk. The whole time, we're constantly turning back, anticipating a black Escalade popping out of nowhere and kidnapping us. But it never did. As soon as we get home, we promise ourselves not to tell our parents, as it would hinder us from hanging out again. The moment that I walked through the door, I blabbed to my parents. I later found out that my friend did the same. The scariest experience of my young life. We grew up in a
Greetings, travelers! The Wanda card from Credit One Bank bestows points for all thy journey's expenses, like rental cars, hotels, flights, feasts.
Get up to 10 times the points on hotels and rental cars when you book through the Credit One Bank Travel Partner. Visit creditonebanktravel.com.
I'm Dr. Megan O'Brien. We're here to discuss Kiehl's new retinol fast-release night serum with real customers. It visibly reduces fine lines and wrinkles and improves firmness.
After 5 days, I feel like my skin was softer, and in the areas that I was concentrating on, the lines on my forehead, they seemed less visible to me.
The lines in my forehead aren't as deep. My skin is a little bit firmer, more supple, and softer throughout.
I feel that my skin has gotten a little bit tighter, and it looks good.
I'm aging gracefully.
Small Midwestern factory town. Snowy, freezing winters and sweltering hot summers. My parents, my mom and stepdad, barely made ends meet. We moved from trailer home to cramped apartment multiple times over. When I was in 4th grade, my family finally had bought a house. Not just any house, but an enormous house. Only problem was that the home was split into a triplex, meaning 3 families could live there in separate quarters. Since we were still dirt poor, my parents of course had to rent out 2 of the 3. This meant that our family of 6 lived in a 2-bedroom shack, a section of the home. The 2nd bedroom was really just a living room off the kitchen, which I shared with my sister and my youngest brother. The door to our home was in the kitchen. My dog Pepe was a natural-born protector. Pepe only weighed about 10 pounds, but he didn't let anything pass his sight without an alert. It's 3 a.m. on a 100-degree August night. 0 air conditioning, windows with too many holes in the screens to leave open. In the Midwest, that equals mosquitoes. The fans are running full blast throughout the space. I wake up to Pepe barking ferociously at the end of my bed. At first, I just stared at him and asked him to quiet down, figuring that he had heard a noise from one of the neighbors. But then I heard a shuffle from the kitchen. I turned left and started to try and focus past the bright light over the kitchen sink. And then I saw something move slightly, and upon meeting each other's gaze, they freeze. There were 2 men standing in the kitchen, and I'll never forget their faces to this day. We just stared at each other for what felt like minutes. Pepe didn't back down, but he also wasn't about to leave his post at the end of my bed. We had saved Pepe from a bad home earlier that year in the freezing winter, so he took his job pretty seriously. His bark was so loud I couldn't even think to scream. My mother suddenly flies out of the bedroom next to ours screaming at the 2 men. All I remember from her is screaming confrontation, and her chest swinging wildly in the bright glare from the kitchen light. The tallest man, at least 6'5" quietly looks at her and says, "Wrong house," connects eyes with me, and they both turn and exit, never to be seen again. My parents decided after that we should start locking our door at night. They justified the men by saying they were probably looking for the neighbors, and they didn't call the police. My mother is strong, independent, and hardworking. She worked her butt off as a sergeant in the Army until she was honorably discharged, after she was taken advantage of by a fellow sergeant. They wanted to keep it hush-hush, which in my opinion was really messed up. She went on to work in a maximum security prison in Georgia, and this is where she met my father, who was also a corrections officer. When they had first met, they bonded over basketball. My mom was somewhat of a star when she was in high school, but a lot of college scouts overlooked her because of her height and color. He was able to go to college for it, until he hurt his knee and had to drop out and search for a different career. She says that everything was great. They were the it couple, a beautiful couple. She still says he was one of the most handsome men that she ever saw. She compares him to the singer Maxwell. He was smart, fit, charming, and funny. Life was perfect until he moved in with her a year into the relationship, and then everything went downhill. She says that some days she would come home from work to find him in a drunken stupor, lines of coke spread out on her own coffee table. They would argue she would toss out his bottles of Jack, and he would smack her across the face. She would have no choice but to go into work the next day sore, with bruises on her face and black eyes. Her neighbors and coworkers knew what was going on, but they turned a blind eye. But the warden even threatened to fire her, saying that it wasn't good for the inmates to see her like that. She decided that she would kick him out, cut all ties, get an order of protection against him, until she found out that she was pregnant. She put off breaking up with him for a while, working doubles just to not go home, basically living at the prison. She only felt safe there, ironically. One day she went home and he was there, sober for once. She told him about the pregnancy. By then she was about 2 months along. He went off saying that he wasn't ready for a child. He demanded that she got rid of it. He gave her money for it the next day before he went to work. Instead of doing that, she spent the money he gave her at the mall. When she got home, he asked her if she had got it done. She said no, explaining that she was 32. She wasn't getting any younger and that she had always wanted a child. She was ready to raise one, with or without him. She says that he glared at her, his eyes full of hatred. If looks could kill, she would have dropped dead right there. He just nodded and said, "Fine, keep it," and stomped off to bed. My mom says that she was surprised. She thought that he would have went off on her. She began to feel hopeful. Maybe he would stop hurting her, stay sober, and they could live happily again. She had dismissed the glare as just her imagination and followed him to bed. She had work early the next day. Sometime during the night, she woke up to find him leaning over her, holding a huge knife to her throat, the same evil look in his eyes from before. "You don't want to do what I tell you, huh? I'll freaking take the baby out of you right now then," he said. They fought, rolling off the bed and crashing to the floor. Somehow she was able to knock the knife out of his hand and it skidded under the bed, out of his reach. She says he then picked her up by her face and threw her against the wall. So she did the only thing she could do and kicked him in the crotch as hard as she could. He let out a yelp and he dropped to his knees. He screamed at her, cupping his balls. My mom says that she quickly grabbed her car keys and ran out of the bedroom. She says her stomach felt like it was on fire, that it hurt so bad and she could barely see. Her head ached from hitting it when she fell off the bed. She got to the living room, wanting to grab her purse before she left. She tried feeling around for it, but couldn't. Father must have worked through his pain because my mom says that he soon followed her. "You're not leaving," he stated, heading towards the kitchen. My mom says that she felt a shiver run through her body. She knew if she didn't leave right then, she would die that night. She knew that he was going for another knife, and she also knew that she wouldn't make it to the front door, since the kitchen was right next to it. There was no way that she could run to the door before he got to her, not in her condition. She felt like she would pass out at any second. She says as she heard my father rummaging in the kitchen, calling her all types of names. She threw open the living room window, pushed out the screen, and climbed out. She hung from her hands, closed her eyes, began praying, and let herself drop. She fell onto one of the large air conditioning units that you usually see outside, landing on her knees and elbows. She says that it hurt like crazy, but she was alive. Thanking God, she crawled off and limped to the parking lot where the car was. She drove off, never looking back. My mom says that she left her whole life behind, her pretty condo, her friends, a job she loved, and escaped to New York, where my grandmother had lived. All because of my father, a man that she loved and someone she thought loved her back. So Dad, although I haven't seen you since I was like 15, I never want to see you again. As a 15-year-old,
link all your cards and track your shopping in one app, no matter how you choose to pay. Take charge of your shopping with PayPal.
Year-old girl who wasn't the shiniest coin in the jar, I very much craved the attention of guys. I didn't date at all until I went to college, though no guy in my school really showed any interest in me. The ones that I thought might never made a move either. So I had found the Whisper app. On the Whisper app, you can anonymously post your thoughts and feelings where basically anyone around the world can see, as well as people who are only a couple of miles away. In fact, there's a separate tab to look at whispers from your area. You can heart people's posts, reply to them, or direct chat with the person. You can choose what info about yourself is available to be seen. When someone decides to direct message you, such as age and gender, I chose not to make that information public. Now, I don't remember what I had posted, but somebody had DM'd me. Their info didn't say much either besides their gender. I was obviously very naive and assumed that it was a guy my age who wanted to talk to me, because the words that he chose and how his messages were written made him seem younger. He asked some questions about me, like how old I was, my interests, and what I did for work, and I answered them. He also asked to see a picture of me, and I sent him one. He told me how beautiful I was and how I was out of his league. He would dodge questions about himself. He would say that he was boring and that he wanted to talk about me. I eventually managed to get him to send a picture of himself, and you guessed it, it was about a mid-40s man. I was surprised that he had sent an honest picture of himself, but at this point I was very understandably freaked out. He then started asking to take me out to dinner, so I kind of stopped talking to him at this point. But he kept trying and saying stuff like, "I'll take you somewhere really nice. I'll throw in a massage." I figured out that you could block people, so that's what I did. And I didn't really think much of it after that. I basically forgot about the conversation after I fell asleep that night. A couple of weeks later, I was at work and it was slammed. The checkout line was starting to wrap around the small store that I worked at. There was only one line but 2 checkout registers at the counter at my work. I had just finished checking out a large order and kind of just looked up to see how bad the line was, and if it seemed like it was going to calm down soon. And that's when I made eye contact with a familiar face, but I couldn't quite place it at first. Then the man smiled and silently mouthed, "Hi there." The image that he sent me in the chat immediately flashed in my mind, and I felt my stomach drop and my heart race. I was terrified and I really didn't want to check this guy out. So I made sure to check people out way slower than I normally do. My coworker checked him out, but I could feel him staring at me the whole time. He even tried to wave me goodbye as he left, and I refused to even slightly turn my head in his direction. As soon as it had calmed down in the store, I went to the bathroom and had a huge panic attack where I nearly threw up. When my mom came to pick me up from work, I very closely watched the side mirror to make sure we weren't being followed by anyone. After that day, I stopped answering DMs if it wasn't somebody who wanted to have an actual conversation about something that I posted. When I was a teenager, my older brother moved out and my parents both worked late, so occasionally I would spend evenings by myself after school. We lived in the countryside a few miles outside of town and had a good collection of neighbors. The day went as normally as ever. I went to school, got home, turned on the TV, had a snack, and texted one of my friends who I had a crush on. It wasn't long afterward that I noticed a man outside my house. He had walked past a few times. He wasn't an ordinary person walking around the block. He looked scraggly and unkempt. I ducked as far as I could behind a chair, still trying to see him out the living room windows, hoping that he didn't see me. But soon he came to the front door and he knocked. I was texting my friend the entire time, increasingly getting freaked out. As he knocked on the door, I stupidly went to answer. I had my phone on me with 911 at the ready. I tried to silently unlock the door and not alert the man, and I opened the door a crack. There was a screen door separating myself and the man, and I was ready to slam the door and lock it if anything happened. The man looked at me with crazed, paranoid eyes. He had a large, dark beard and looked to be in his late 50s or early 60s. He seemed out of breath and his face was drenched with sweat. He was larger too, more the reason to keep my guard. I sheepishly said, "Hello? Please call the police, they're after me," he said in an exhausted smoker voice. He kept looking at the road and tensed whenever a car would occasionally pass. "Who's after you?" I asked, getting ready to slam the door. "I barely escaped. They were right behind me. Please, can I come inside?" At this point, I knew to call the police. "Just wait here, I'll get someone to help." My heart was in my throat at this time. I didn't know if this guy was then going to try to force open the door, so I quickly shut it and locked it. I ran to the back door and locked that as well as I called 911. My heart was racing and I could barely tell the operator my information, but they said that they would send somebody out. It wasn't long until the patrol car arrived, but it felt like forever. The entire time I kept watching the man who then walked into my driveway pacing nervously. The officer got out and proceeded to talk with the man, and they got in the car and they left. I have no idea what happened to him nor if he was telling the truth. He could have been drunk or crazy, but it was a genuine fear in his eyes when I looked at him. Someone truly scared him, and it scared me to think that there could be someone out there that wanted people for whatever reason.
Hey, it's me, your skin. Some cleansers get us clean, but take my moisture. CeraVe cleansers help me maintain my moisture balance with hyaluronic acid plus 3 essential ceramides to help restore my natural barrier. So we're CeraVe clean.
CeraVe Hydrating Cleanser.
It's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. In 2017, me and a couple of friends went to an old bell tower looking for an adventure. I could never have imagined what horror lay in wait for us. We barely made it out alive, and one of our dearest friends went missing. 5 years later, we returned to look for him. There had been recent sightings near the tower. We assembled a small crew, and against our best judgment, we went back. What happened there has scarred me physically and mentally for life. Whatever we've disturbed from the old bell tower near my house has started to affect my town. By Reggae Junkie G. Part 1. Well, we managed to escape again, only just. But then people started going missing around town. Everybody's keeping it all hushed up. Nobody wants to talk about what's going on. Now it seems to be spreading like wildfire. I really hope this was all over. In the week after we got out, there was a night they didn't show up outside my window, and I felt the biggest weight off my shoulders. But now things seem to be getting worse. My dad, who works in the distillery, has a shift rotation every 4 weeks. Day shift 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., twilight shift 2:30 to 10:30 p.m., and then night shift 10 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. After Ash, Dennis, and Sean started showing up at my window, I had to tell him about it. His twilight shift started the next day, on the Monday. I begged him to believe me, but he assumed I was just talking about suspicious people hanging around after dark, and that's what he told the police. I can't say I blame him for not believing me, but it still annoyed me. My dad's work is a little over an hour away, so he sometimes gets home on a good night at 11:30. Sometimes it can be midnight before he gets in. I told him how they always show up at midnight, when the bells ring. Well, he just nodded along, only half listening. God, I'm freaking 19, not 9. I'm not lying. But he just thought I was trying to play some kind of joke. That night I heard the bells and I ran to get him. He was still awake, getting his sleeping pattern in check for the awkward shift times. We went to the window, and sure enough, I could have almost predicted what would happen. They never showed up. The bells clanging away, loud as hell, but they were nowhere to be seen. You can at least hear the bells, I asked, feeling annoyed that I now looked insane. Yeah. He pointed his ear to the window. Oh yeah, I hear them. Oh, that's weird, he said, and side glanced at me before turning away. Well, I knew he couldn't hear them. Dad, you can't hear that. Oh, it's loud as fuck. I pressed him, feeling deflated. Danny, get to bed, son. I'll see you in the morning. He left my room, closing the door behind him. I tried phoning Brian again for probably the 800th time, with no answer. However, on Monday, before my dad left work, I was finally able to get hold of him. Brian, where the hell have you been? I've been in my bedroom with the blinds closed. I haven't left for over a week. I didn't hear the bells last night. Did you? He asked, and his voice sounded weak. He sounded like his whole body was deteriorating. Yeah, I heard them, but they never came to the window. I tried to get my dad to look, but they didn't show up. Well, he couldn't hear the bells either. I think I'm about one step away from being bundled into a white van and spending the next couple of years in a straitjacket. Brian laughed. I need to get out of here, Danny. This is no way to live. If I have to look at another pot noodle, I think I'm going to have a mental breakdown. I've been shitting through the eye of a needle, man. I couldn't help but laugh. Well, the situation was far from funny. All right, Brian, come here tonight. We can get something to eat, and you won't be by yourself. My dad starts the twilight shift soon, so it'd be good to have you here. Aye, that sounds good. I'll get ready and I'll be over about 5. Aye, no worries, mate. I'll see you soon. The sound of my dad getting ready to leave for work caught my attention, so I went downstairs to see him. Dad, I know you don't believe me, but just try and get home as early as you can tonight. I'll always try and get home early, Danny, he said with a smirk on his face. But, you know what I mean, even earlier. I just do it. Right, okay, whatever. Look, I'll be home as soon as I can. He turned to grab his work bag and keys, kissed my mum and patted my back on the way out. When the door closed, I don't know what it was, but a horrible feeling took over me. Oh, please don't let this be the last time I see him, I thought to myself. I went back to my room, really just waiting around for Brian now. My mum kept coming in to check on me. Well, they obviously both think I've lost my mind. After 5 o'clock came and went, I started to get a bit restless, worrying. Well, I knew he'd probably just be running late, but a part of me had doubts and I didn't like it. It was giving me a bad feeling. Around 5:40 p.m., Brian showed up at last. I was trying my best to contact him constantly, but I never got an answer until he was standing on my doorstep. Brian, late as ever, I gestured. Come on in. I led him into the back lounge, which is kind of like a dining room, but not really. My mum was in the adjoining kitchen making dinner, but we didn't want dinner. We wanted a feast, so we sat down and ordered loads of takeaway food. Brian seemed reluctant to talk. Well, he was giving mostly yes or no answers, or keeping answers to a 2 or 3 word minimum. It was close to 10:30 before Brian started to engage in a proper conversation. He was asking about my dad. Did you say he finished at 10:30? Yeah. I've told him to try and get away fast and come home early. He still thinks I'm a loony, though. Brian laughed. Well, hopefully he gets home sharpish. My mum popped her head into my room. I'm going to bed, boys. Good night. Good night, Brian, she said. Night, we both responded at the same time. There were a few moments of silence, and then Brian piped up again. What do you think it is? I mean, in the bell tower, I mean. Well, I haven't got the slightest idea. Some unbelievably belligerent and malicious thing that takes people. I wouldn't even know what to call it, I said, and I genuinely had no clue. People always said witches haunted that area. Maybe it's them, or maybe they summoned something or some things that got out of control. I don't know. I'm just wondering. Brian then bowed his head. Played a couple of games of FIFA before I got bored because Brian always annihilated me. Felt like we were waiting forever before I noticed the clock was finally nearing 11:30. I waited anxiously by the window, looking for my dad's car. 11:30 came and went. Nothing. 11:40. Still nothing. As the clock approached 11:50, I started to panic. Only a matter of time before the bells chime and they show up outside. God, I was pacing back and forth. Hurry up, Dad, I spoke to myself as Brian sat nervously watching me. The flash of headlights outside caught me off guard. I shot over to the window. It was the police, driving up and down the street. I looked up at the clock again. 11:55 p.m. My heart sank. Then a loud clicking of the deadbolt being unlatched and the front door opening startled me. I ran to the top of the stairs and looked down. My dad was stumbling through the doorway looking disheveled. "Oh, Dad, you're finally home," and I smiled. He ambled into the hallway and glanced at me before shaking his head. He looked tired and fed up. "I'm going to bed," he mumbled. I could only barely make out what he said. He climbed the stairs and pretty much pushed past me as he made his way to his bedroom, shutting the door behind him. I went back to my room where Brian was eagerly awaiting my return. Headlights then caught my attention from the window again. I saw the police car driving back and forth for another few minutes. We both eyed the clock as the second hand seemed to be in no rush to tick its way to midnight. Oh, that last 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes. 3, 2, 1. We both held our breath. I looked at Brian. The sound of the clock was all we could hear. I looked back up. 12:01 a.m. The bells didn't ring. I darted to the window and looked outside. The police car was parked about 2 houses over. There was absolutely nothing else to see. I smiled and turned to Brian. "There's nothing there," I said. I exhaled and my mind felt pure relief. Brian didn't want to believe anything too soon, but I could see the tension in his body begin to wane. I looked out again, and the police car was gone. Maybe it worked then. Maybe nothing happened because other people would find out or other people would see. I don't care. Don't care. I would finally be able to sleep worry-free, even if just for one night. Brian began to ease up some more. "Oh, maybe it's over," he said, seeming unsure of his own words. Maybe," I responded, gazing out of the window. Game of FIFA?" Brian's mood seemed to have shifted in an instant. "Honestly, man, I just want to go to sleep," I replied, and Brian laughed. "Shake back." I smiled and looked out of the window one last time. It was 10 past midnight and still nothing. I couldn't have been happier in that moment. I set Brian up on the floor with some blankets and cushions and then switched the light off. Just before I got into bed, "Danny," Brian whispered. "What's up?" "Sorry, man, but would it be alright if we left the light on?" God, I felt so bad for him. "Just any light. I can't handle total darkness. I'm sorry, man." But he sounded upset. "Don't be sorry, mate. It's fine. I'll put the TV on, and I'll put my computer on," I said as I plugged my TV into the wall. "Thanks." "Yeah, no problem." I turned my PC on, fired up the monitor, then got into bed. I put a random channel on. They were showing A Nightmare on Elm Street. I saw Brian turn away from the TV. I switched it over to Comedy Central. 2 episodes of The Ricky Gervais Show and then 2 of South Park were shown in the guide. Perfect. I lay back and tried to turn my brain off, but my mind was still racing, as it always was, and I'd had trouble sleeping ever since the first day in the bell tower. It was barely past 1 a.m. when the hall light went on. The slit of light at the bottom of my door caught my attention. Dad must be going for a piss, I thought to myself. My vision was a little blurry because I was about 5 seconds away from dozing off, but I could make out the shadows of feet walking down the hall towards the toilet. I closed my eyes. Footsteps coming back along the hall seemed to wake me, or was I even asleep there? Back again towards the toilet. I heard mumbling, quiet and then incoherent mumbling again. Back past my room again. and again. And then they stopped. They stopped right at my door. I looked at Brian to see if he'd noticed what was happening. All I could see were his wide eyes staring at the two shadows at the bottom of my door. He'd pulled the blanket up, almost completely covering his face. After a couple of very long minutes, the shadows walked away again, in the direction of the stairs. I didn't know what to think. Should I be worried? Danny, what's going on? Brian's muffled voice came from beneath his blanket. I don't know. I think my dad's sleepwalking or something. Oh, go and look. Brian jerked his thumb in the direction of the door. Fuck off. I'm not looking, I snapped back. So you're just gonna let a random person walk around your house? Look, it's obviously not a random person. They came from the end of the hall. It's my mum and dad's room. There's nothing else up there. Right. Okay. Brian didn't believe me for some reason. Well, it was my dad. I just didn't understand what he was doing or why. After about half an hour, we heard rummaging downstairs, things being moved, lots of walking around, and my dad's voice talking. I looked at Brian again. He'd fallen asleep. I just tried my best to ignore whatever he was doing and get myself to sleep. That wasn't easy, but I did eventually fall asleep. When I woke up in the morning, Brian was standing at my window looking puzzled. I rubbed my eyes as they adjusted to the brightness. What are you doing? Brian never looked at me. He just said, Come here. His voice sounded weak. I climbed out of bed and made my way to the window, which looked out into my front garden and driveway. My dad, looking like he'd been up all night, almost looked like he was homeless. He was pacing around the garden, mumbling to himself, talking fast and making wild gestures that seemed to be involuntary and twitching. He just looked like a complete mess. Another thing I noticed was his car windscreen was completely shattered. I opened the window then, but Brian grabbed my hand. Remember what William was last seen doing before he disappeared? He asked, keeping his voice down. Yeah, but this isn't the same. Surely, this is my dad. This isn't the same thing. I was doubting my own words as I stumbled over them. Dad, I called out the window. Well, he stopped immediately and looked up. What are you doing? I thought I was the loony, I said with a slight nervous smile. He smiled back for a second, and then, without hesitation, he bolted to the car and started it up, reversed out the drive like a maniac, almost hitting another two cars, and then floored it down the street. We didn't know what to do or say. We just ran down the stairs and into the street, only to see his car turn left towards the town centre. What the? We need to phone someone. The police or something, Brian said. Yeah, get inside. We need to do something, quickly. I then led Brian back into the house. My mum led us inside, looking like she'd just woken up. She had no idea what had just happened. Dad was acting weird, and he just sped away in his car with his window all smashed up. Did he say anything to you? She looked worried. I'm like, no. I don't even remember him coming home last night. What was he doing? I was walking around, talking to himself. They jumped in his car and drove away. I don't even know how he can see out of his windscreen. Well, she picked up the phone and dialed 999 at once. A swift 3 hours later, 2 officers are sitting in my lounge asking my mum a series of questions, while Brian and I were standing listening at the doorway. They seemed to be taking nothing too seriously. Well, this all felt like a big, stupid waste of time. Until... I can't be 100%. Maybe I am finally losing it, but... Well, the officer taking notes and more or less nodding along to the entire conversation. I could swear he looked at me and smiled, just for a split second. A large crooked smile that seemed to disappear almost instantly, but his glowing yellow eyes burned right into mine for what felt like an eternity. It lasted less than a second, but that look is permanently imprinted in my mind and I can't shake it off. My blood ran ice cold as I watched them both get up and move slowly towards my mum as she took a sip of her coffee.
Meet the destination sofa with extra deep seating and Comfort Flex springs, only at Haverty's.
Part 2. "Mom!" I yelped, holding my arm outstretched. She looked over to me, barely noticing the advancing policeman. Ryan looked shocked and confused at my outburst, like he was ready to run, but didn't know why. "Get back!" I screeched as one of the officers' glowing yellow eyes met mine. His foaming black-toothed grin gave me a feeling of being stabbed in the stomach. The room began to distort and twist. I could have sworn I was spinning. All the rest of the world was. The sun had more or less disappeared and darkness began to creep in all around me. I hunched over in pain as I watched the other officer slowly extend his hand. My mum gazed at him, seemingly in a trance-like state. I struggled to force any more words from my mouth. My mum took his hand and slowly stood up, eyes locked with the officer. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Corcoran," he said. In a flash, I found myself on the ground, retching, feeling vulnerable and weak. I looked up. My mum was shaking hands with the policeman. "Oh, thank you so much for coming. If I hear anything, I'll phone straight away," she said. "Danny, you okay?" I looked around and saw Brian kneeling on the other side of me, looking concerned. My mum and the police officers noticed and dashed to pick me up. My mum was panicking, and the two officers helped me to my feet. "You all right there, son?" the older one said, while my head was still spinning. God, did I just imagine that? I thought to myself. "No, I'm fine. I'm okay. Just felt a bit dizzy and a bit sick," I replied. The young guy helped me to the couch. I was wary of him touching me after that smile I'd seen earlier, but he seemed normal. He seemed absolutely fine. "Thanks. Honestly, I'm okay," I reassured them, while trying to motion to my mum to get them out of the house. "Okay, as long as you're feeling better," the young officer said, flashing that wide grin of perfect white teeth, in contrast starkly to earlier. Could I be sure I'd seen that? Or maybe I did imagine it. I watched from the window as the two officers hastily left and got into their car. As they pulled away, the younger officer side-glanced at me and winked, his eye changing from white to yellow for a split second before they were out of view. I stood with my mouth hanging open. Brian put a finger under my chin and closed my mouth for me. "What's wrong, Danny?" Brian looked worried. "That guy, that police guy, he was different." "Different how?" Brian asked. I turned and looked at him, shaking my head. "Like Belter different. His eyes and his face, something wasn't right." I began feeling the stabbing pain in my stomach once again. "Maybe you just imagined it. Everything seemed fine to me. Except you almost dying," he sniggered. "I don't know, man. Maybe, I feel sick. I need to lie down a minute, and then we're going out to look for my dad." Brian quickly realized it wasn't a time for joking around. He took on a more serious demeanor. "Head upstairs and lie down. I'll get you in 15 minutes. He patted my back as I walked away. Lying staring at my ceiling, I couldn't help but question my own sanity. Nothing had ever happened outside the bell tower before. Then again, Sean and the others had been showing up outside my house. Maybe whatever was in there had managed to get out somehow. I felt my eyes heavy. The bell tower plagued my mind and my senses. I felt myself beginning to doze off, and the bells rang off in the distance, and my body felt heavy. I was slipping away into sleep. I found myself standing within the perimeter of the fence. Sean was kicking the door to the bell tower. It splintered and cracked, eventually bursting open as I looked on, feeling the most unreal déjà vu. "Simple as that," he chuckled as he turned to me with his face covered in black, pulsing veins. The door, the latch, and most of the wood holding it in place completely ripped off. Sean laughed like a maniac as his eyes pulled me closer towards him. I almost fell out of my bed as Brian burst in the room. "Feeling any better?" he asked. My head throbbed as his words rattled the inside of my brain. "Oh, Danny, you look like shit," he said as he put his hand on my shoulder. "No, I'm fine." I slapped his hand away, cold sweat pouring down my face. "Well, let's just get out of here and find my dad. Look, I'm fine." Brian didn't seem convinced, however. 5 minutes later, we were roaming the streets on bikes. I had my dad's bike, and Brian had my old bike that I hadn't used for about 5 years. God, it was insanely small. It was small for me when I was 14, and he actually looked hilarious. We took turns almost at random, keeping our general direction mostly northbound, mainly because I had a bad feeling he might have ended up at the bell tower. I could feel eyes on me. I kept looking all around me. Everybody seemed to be staring at me and looking away when I'd catch them. I don't know if I was becoming paranoid or if this was really happening. I shook my head and slapped my face, focusing on the road ahead as best I could. Brian was slowing us way down, almost kneeing himself in the face with every pedal. We cycled for hours, down countless streets. No sign of my dad or his car anywhere. We'd come to the northern part of Fort William, just before you leave the town to get to Ben Nevis. There's not much around. A few streets we tried and some wooded areas. There's a smallish retail part just before you exit the town. There's a couple of supermarkets there, so we stopped at the M&S food hall to pick up something to eat and some water to take with us. We had a few more hours until nighttime, so we needed some supplies. I chained the bikes together, and we caught our breath before heading outside. "Oh, what a tune, man," Brian blurted out as we entered. Somebody's Watching Me by Rockwell played throughout the supermarket's PA system, a bit too loudly in my opinion. "Yeah, very apt for us," I laughed as I turned to Brian, who was grabbing a trolley. "We don't really need a trolley. I mean, we're not getting much." Well, Brian looked at me. "I don't care. I'm not carrying stuff." The supermarket was pretty empty, which I always prefer. God, I hate standing in queues. Before I knew it, Brian had whizzed away towards the deli aisle for some sandwiches. I headed straight for the snacks aisle, which was apparently at the other end of the shop. Well, I was walking fast, so I couldn't be dead sure, but passing the kitchenware aisle, for a split second, I could swear I saw Sean in my periphery, sliding a large blade from a knife block and staring right at me. I stopped and looked back. There was just some old guy looking at the label of a frying pan. Yes, I felt relieved, but that initial feeling of dread didn't fully go away. I found myself standing staring at the crisps, quietly singing along to the song and not being able to decide what I wanted to eat. Just as the iconic chorus sung by Michael Jackson kicked in, the lights above me flickered. I looked up. The music began to drown and fade, like I was rapidly being pulled into a tunnel. I heard something else. Humming. Someone behind me was humming with a little help from my friends by the Beatles. The hair on my neck stood up. I began feeling faint as my vision blurred. "Danny, are you sure this is the right one?" I froze in fear as I recognized Liam's voice. My legs began to give way, and I turned to see Liam standing holding a live magpie in his hands. His face was swollen and red. It looked like multiple chunks of flesh had been ripped off. His eyes just stared me down as I slowly got lower. And out of nowhere, a large kitchen knife was plunged into the bird, all the way through and right through Liam's hand. Sean was standing laughing wildly. "Well, Danny boy, is it?" Liam's dead gaze never faltered. I felt a stabbing pain in my gut. I dropped to the ground, covering my eyes and screaming for help. A hand on my shoulder startled me, and I moved away down the aisle. "Danny, what's wrong, man? What's going on?" I opened my eyes and saw Brian standing in front of me looking worried. The music blared through the PA, and the supermarket seemed calm. Brian helped me up. "Danny, tell me what's going on, man. Oh, this has happened twice today." I barged his shoulder as I shoved past him without saying a word. I just needed to get outside for some air. Brian was right behind me and grabbed me to turn me around. "Danny, whatever's happening, you need to tell me, and you need to tell me now." I sighed and looked at the ground. I saw Liam and Sean in there. Earlier today, one of the policemen looked like that demon thing. And then I see Liam and Sean in M&S. Oh, I don't know what's going on, Brian, but this thing seems to be stalking me. People are going missing and nobody's saying anything about it. I don't know what's going on. I wish I did, but I don't. Brian just glared at me with a look of guilt on his face. I'm sorry, man. This feels like this never going to end. And it feels like it's spreading. I know what you mean, Brian said. We need to find out if there's a way we can put a stop to this for good. Find out about the history of the tower. Speak to anyone who's worked there for any reason. Maintaining the land, restoration work, or anything at all. We track them down. Anyone who's had any kind of history with the bell tower. We find out as much as we can about it. Look, you never know, Danny. We might just find out exactly what we're looking for. I nodded. Brian's little motivational speech was a valiant effort. We really do need to cling on to hope, but we also need to find my dad and make sure we avoid being taken ourselves. Look, I think I know where to start, I said proudly as I looked at Brian. Right, the bell tower fence has signs on it telling you not to go in or climb the fence. They're from a security company. There's always security companies looking after old buildings like that. I'm thinking we try them. I smiled, awaiting Brian's reaction to my brainwave. But he never smiled back. So, you mean we're going back there? He said, his voice shaking. No, Brian, well, I mean, yes, but we're not going in. We're just going to get a name or number of the company in charge of the grounds. When Brian looked down at his feet, I don't want to go, Danny. Please don't make me go. Aye, but Brian, we need to. At least come to the woods with me and I'll go in myself. I swear we're not going any further than the fence. Brian thought for a few moments. Alright, to the woods. I'm not going any further, Danny. I'm sorry. Right, to the woods. I'll be 5 minutes max. I hopped on my bike and led the way. The road was quiet and we seemed to get there in no time at all. Right, I'll go in. I'm walking up to the fence and turning back. I'll be no more than 10 minutes, I told Brian. Hey, I thought you said 5. I did, but it's probably about 5 minutes each way. I'll run. I'll be quick, I promise. Okay, he said, seemingly annoyed, but we never had time to hang around arguing. I turned and ran through the woods. The bell tower quickly came into view, but that wasn't all. My dad's car sat just off to the side. The body was badly dented and the windows were all smashed. I stopped for a moment and stared. Well, there was nobody inside. Proceeding with extreme caution, I slowly made my way over to his car and looked inside. Oh, the seats were torn to shreds. I couldn't see a path into this area where a car would be able to get through. I mean, this made absolutely no sense. Then my phone buzzed. It was Brian. Hurry up, man. Something doesn't feel right out here, he said. I'm just coming. Brian hung up without saying anything else. I opened my camera and took 2 pictures of my dad's car. And then a shrill scream came from the bell tower. I walked back around to the front of the fence and looked from top to the bottom. I saw the door gently banging off the frame as it moved freely in the wind. A large section of it was completely gone. Nothing was holding it shut. It looked exactly as it had in my dream. No lock, no latch. Well, maybe that was it. I turned and bolted back through the woods, stopping myself after about 30 seconds. The security company, I said to myself. I quickly sprinted back and pulled my phone out to take a picture of the sign attached to the fence. And when I got there, Sean, Ash, and Dennis were standing in the doorway looking at me. I slowed almost to a halt. They just stared as I crept up to the fence and held out my phone to take a photo. I made sure to try and get them into the shot to show Brian when I got back. Sean waved me over. Danny boy, just come with us, man. You're only delaying the inevitable. Then they all laughed. I turned and ran back through the woods. I could see Brian waiting anxiously at the roadside, looking all around him. When I came out of the trees, Brian almost jumped out of his skin. Oh, fucking shut myself there. Where were you? I mean, you said 10 minutes. That was like... He pulled out his phone. 13 minutes. Look, I went as fast as I could. Something's definitely going on, man. You're telling me? All I've had is shadows in the trees telling me to follow them. Well, that's the least of our worries right now. My dad's car is up at the bell tower, and I saw Sean, Ash, and Dennis up there. I explained, picking my bike up. Shit, what are they doing? How the hell did your dad's car get there? Surely that's impossible. Well, apparently not. They weren't doing much, just standing there trying to get me to go in. I got a picture of them and the car. Hey, did you get the security sign? Yeah, got that too. I pulled my phone out to show Brian the pictures. My dad's car was a first. Oh, God, that's insane, man. I can't even imagine how that's possible, Brian said, sounding as shocked as ever. Me neither. Right, look at this one. I got the next picture of the security sign up. Where are they? Brian asked, scrutinizing the photo. What? God, they were in the doorway. I zoomed in. I swear, man, they were there. I looked, dumbfounded, at my phone. Almost had a heart attack when it rang in my hand. Oh, it's my mum, I said to Brian, rolling my eyes as I turned to walk away. Hello? I answered. Hi, son. It's Mum. Just to let you know, you can come home now. Your dad's back. Part 3. What do you mean he's back? I screeched down the phone. I mean, where is he? Is he in the house? I mean, he's back. I don't know what else could have possibly have meant. I know he's not come inside yet. I just saw him out the window sitting in the garden. Just thought I'd phone and let you know. I'm about to go out and see him. No. What? Don't go out. Just stay inside, please. I had a horrible feeling she wasn't going to do what I told her, but I had to try my best. Just lock the doors and windows. Don't let him in. Just don't let him in. I'm on my way now. Why have I not to let him in? What's going on, Danny? Just don't fucking let him in, please, Mum. Don't you speak to your mother like... Okay, I'm sorry, I interrupted. Can you just go and lock the doors now, please? And check the windows? You're scaring me, Danny. What's going... She trailed off as 3 loud knocks came at the door. Is that him? I whispered. 2 seconds. I'll go and look. Her nonchalant attitude was beginning to bug me. About 20 seconds had passed. Mum! I whispered loudly. It's him, but something's not right. Why doesn't he just come in? He's just standing there with his back facing the door. Danny, what's going on? I don't know. Just lock the door. I'll be there soon. Okay. Bye, she said as I heard the locks clicking and clacking through the phone. We rolled up slowly on our bikes. Brian was a bit behind me. The house came into view, but I couldn't see anyone in the garden. As I got closer, I could see the door was slightly ajar, and I began to worry. Brian saw too. Danny, you see that? Yeah. Let's just be careful. I cautiously approached the doorway and noticed the wood had completely come away, like the 3 locks had burst right through the frame. I gently pushed the door open, with Brian practically on my back. I looked all around as we entered. I could only really see up the stairs, part of the living room and into the kitchen. We crept into the living room, and nothing seemed to be disturbed. A movement from above startled us both. I held my breath. Another movement. You should go up, Brian whispered. Oh, I don't think so. You go, I snapped back, keeping my voice hushed. The noise turned to what I can only describe as dragging footsteps. Just go to the front door. We can see up the stairs from there. I gestured for Brian to turn around and walk back to the hallway. The door was still wide open, good in case we needed to make a sharp exit. We quietly inched toward the bottom of the stairs, and as we got closer, I could see feet at the top. Another step forward revealed a pair of shins. We continued like this until I was able to see enough to confirm it was actually my mum at the top, just standing there listening, leaning forward a few inches as if that somehow improves her hearing. "Oh, Mum, I nearly had a heart attack," I said as we all relaxed a little. "Where is he?" I asked. "I don't know. He kicked the door in, so I ran upstairs and hid in the cupboard." She looked pretty shaken up. "Well, how long ago did he leave?" "I don't know. I was upstairs. I couldn't hear anything." "Right, okay, Mum. This is going to sound a bit crazy, but I really need you to believe me this time." I looked deep into her eyes, and she nodded with her mouth partially open. "It's not Dad. That wasn't him that came here. It's something either possessing him or mimicking him. It's something from that bell tower." I saw her face change. She was losing interest. "I'm serious, Mum. This isn't a joke. Dad's car is at the bell tower, all smashed up. Look." I pulled up the pictures and showed her, and her jaw dropped slightly more. "So, is he in the tower?" she asked, stuttering. "I don't know. I don't think so, but we need to do something to stop all this happening. People around us are disappearing and it needs to stop." She looked at Brian then. "Is this all true, Brian? Please don't play games." "It's true, all of it. I've seen it myself," Brian answered, turning to go back to the living room. Mum scoffed, shaking her head, and walked away. "Danny." We all froze in fear. I looked up the stairs. My dad was standing at the top, black pulsing veins wrapping his face, his yellow eyes like laser beams, and felt like they could have blinded me. "Danny boy," he growled as he took one step down. I turned to my mum and Brian, who both stood still like petrified wood with their mouths gaping. "Oh, run!" I screamed, and I turned and bolted out the door, grabbing the bike. Brian was right behind me and shot off almost instantly. My mum came scurrying out, constantly looking behind her while she wailed in terror. "Come on, jump on," I ordered. She quickly got on the bike seat and gripped onto me. I stood up on the pedals and pushed with everything I had. Then the chain came off, and we both fell in a heap on the ground. I looked at Brian first, who'd pulled over and was shouting for us to get up. Then I looked at the front door of my house. My dad was standing within the frame, almost crouching because he'd grown taller. His body looked like writhing vines wrapping themselves around him. His legs had contorted in a way that having knees wouldn't allow, and his face leaked a dark yellow and brownish fluid from every orifice. His mouth foamed and spat in anger as he stomped onto the porch with his twisted legs that almost looked like the roots of a tree. "Get back here, Brian, and get my mum," I called over, still struggling to process what was right in front of me. Brian circled over and was there in a flash, and he helped my hysterical mum onto the seat. "What are you going to do?" Brian asked, slowly backing away from the advancing beast. "I don't know. It doesn't matter, just get her out of here now. I'll meet you at your house." My mum was visibly trembling as she climbed onto Brian's bike and they cycled off. I stood up and faced my dad. He'd stopped in the middle of the garden. A menacing low-end growl slowly escaped his lips, and he smiled his widest and stood up to full stretch. He looked about 8 or 9 feet tall, his long arms almost down to his knees. "Come and give your old dad a hug, son," he said in a crackled, demonic tone. I turned and ran as fast as I could down the street, screaming for help, screaming for anybody. He gave chase, every one of his strides seeming to move the earth. I turned the first corner and almost got smacked by a car. I stood panting with my hands on the bonnet. The driver looked terrified. I probably looked like a murderer on the run. Help me, please. Well, the driver just stared at me, looking panicked. He threw the car into gear and reversed. I crumpled onto the road and rolled over onto my back. I just lay there, breathing rapidly, staring at the sky. The clouds gave me the feeling I was moving. Raindrops began to patter onto my head. I must have been lying there for about 5 minutes, and nothing had happened. Finally, I got myself to my feet, and I noticed how empty the streets were as I looked around. I could hear nothing but the breeze. I rounded the corner onto my street. Nothing there. I began to feel my body relax, my muscles loosen, and my mind felt relieved. Cautiously, I crept up towards my house. I could see my bike lying in the driveway. The door to the house was flapping wildly, opening and banging shut non-stop, and there was barely even any wind. I hopped over the fence and shot in to grab the bike. I picked it up, and then the door was still slamming behind me. I looked around. The breeze had picked up. The silence of the empty streets was unnerving. I fixed the chain and cycled off in the direction of Brian's house. The rain had started to pick up now, and the streets seemed cold. Brian's face was pressed against the window when his house came into view. He saw me and waved me over. I saw my mum's head behind him, peeking over his shoulder. I practically leapt off the bike and ran inside. Brian and my mum had cups of tea and biscuits ready. Glad to see you two are all nice and cozy, I jested. Brian's house was warm, and I was grateful for the heat. The kettle's just boiled. Help yourself, Brian said. I'm good. We need to get a hold of these security people, see what information we can drag out of them. Well, what are you going to ask them? Brian asked, with a mouthful of biscuits. I don't know, but something about the door not being able to close might be the key here. I saw something like that in my dream, the door flapping around wildly after Sean kicked it in. Then they were all standing at the door in the picture I tried to take. I don't know, but it's the best idea I have right now. I got the picture of the sign up on my phone and zoomed in. Nevis Security. Taking security to new heights. 0139 7701 333. I looked confused at the sign. New heights, I laughed, looking at Brian. I've literally never seen a single security guard or vehicle anywhere near there. What a great security company, Brian said sarcastically, shaking his head before having a drink of his tea. Anyway, let's phone him, I said, punching the number into my phone. What's this for? Who is it you're phoning? My mum butted in. It's a long story, and we don't have time, I replied, listening to the ringing intently, waiting for someone to answer. Nevis Security? A male voice came from the receiver. Yeah, hi, my name's John. I'm wondering if you can help me out with some information about the old bell tower, near Ben Nevis. What kind of information? The guy sounded stern, almost unfriendly. We were, wondering who owns the grounds, or even that building. The building and the grounds are owned and operated by the council, sir. We just make sure nobody gets in there. That's dangerous, he said proudly. I could almost imagine him sitting with his chest puffed out. I rolled my eyes and glanced at Brian. Okay, well, I saw some kids up there, and it looks like they've snapped the lock and the latch off, so the door's just wide open now. There was a long pause. He came back after about 60 seconds. Hi there. Sorry for the wait. I'm just going to put you through to my manager. He'd like to have a word with you if that's okay. Okay, no problem. Hold the line, please, sir. After a few minutes of this horrible plinky-plunky music, another man answered. His voice was more alert and intimidating. Hello there, sir. I'd like to know what it is exactly you saw at the bell tower. I don't know why, but I felt very reluctant to tell this guy anything. Well, I saw 3 kids, or more like 3 teenagers. They were standing in the doorway, and a large section of the door had been broken. It was just flapping about in the wind, I explained, not knowing what to expect. Did you not recognize any of them? He asked sharply. Well, no, I didn't recognize any of them, I lied. Okay, We'll need to make a quick report, then we'll get somebody out there to secure the building. Just a few quick questions, is that alright, sir? Yes, fine. Yes. Superb, he said, and I could almost hear him smiling. I walked into the kitchen to get away from the incessant slurping of tea. The security manager kept talking. Okay, so, where did the incident take place? Bell Tower. Okay, I've got that. So when did this happen? What date and roughly what time? I was going through my mind trying to figure out what was happening here. All I wanted was information about the building, and suddenly I'm filing some reports. It was yesterday, probably about noon. I just said the first thing that came to mind. Great. And there were 3 teenagers? Yeah, 3. Okay, and you said you didn't recognize any of them. Was there anything else to note? Anything suspicious nearby? No. You hesitated a little bit there. Are you sure? Yeah, I'm sure. What about your dad's car? I froze. I felt cold. Sorry? I asked shakily. Come on, Danny boy. Your dad's car was there all smashed up. I know it was, because it was me who fucking smashed it up. His voice began to change now. I can't believe you didn't recognize me, your old pal. How could you not recognize me, Danny boy? I'm so hurt. And then he let out an overly sarcastic cry. Sean? I gasped. My voice cracked and trembled. He just laughed like a maniac until I eventually ended the call. I staggered back into the living room, feeling dazed and confused. My eyes felt hot. What did they say? Brian asked. I just stood there staring. Are you okay, son? My mum looked worried. Yeah, I'm fine. It's just... It wasn't the security. I was struggling to find my words. What does that even mean? Brian asked with a look of contempt. The security people... They're not them. The guy put me onto a manager, then out of nowhere I was talking to Sean. Ryan stood up. Oh, shit. He put his hand on his forehead. We need to go to the Highland Council. The site's owned by them. Maybe they know something. What if it's just a bunch of Seans there too? Ryan snapped back. Then I don't know. I know it has something to do with that door. The door needs to be sealed. We just need to find someone who can help. Hey, easier said than done, Brian said, grabbing his jacket. Mum, you'll have to just stay here. We'll go to the council building, see if there's anyone we can speak to. I'll phone if anything happens. Okay, she said, a tear streaming down her cheek, then she gave both of us a hug. The air around town seemed thick, like it was difficult to draw a full breath. We cycled to the council building as fast as we could. It's inside an industrial estate that seemed a little too on the quiet side. There was something eerie about it. I opened the door to what appeared to be the normal bustling council HQ. I scanned the sign at the reception desk. Council house repairs, pest control, housing applications and rent inquiries, register births, deaths and marriages. Planning and building standards. That should be it, desk 7. I scanned the large open plan office building, and a tall slender man with a round head and small round spectacles sat by a desk with a huge number 7 on the front. One of us should stay and keep an eye out, I suggested. Brian looked at me. Hey, I'll go over, he said. You sure? I don't mind. I'll do it. I'll ask about getting the door sealed and see if there's any information about what's going on. If anything like this has ever happened before or whatever. Right, okay. I'll just keep watch then. If anything dodgy happens, I'll come and get you. Ryan shuffled over, looking like a nervous wreck, and sat down. The man's beady eyes seemed to be constantly darting around the room as he spoke. Something about him just seemed shifty. I scanned the room because I could feel eyes on me from somewhere. I kept catching these haunting grins in my periphery, but as I looked around it seemed that nobody was actually looking at me. I felt like I was going mad. Brian swiftly came back over. Okay, so he told me the bell tower has a particularly dark and bloody history and was used by occultists for some kind of brutal rituals or ceremonies and stuff, years and years ago. Apparently one of these rituals caused the building to collapse, and only the bell tower remained. Something intensely evil has been sealed inside for God knows how long. He said if a door isn't sealed, well, he doesn't actually know, but he said it's been a priority of the council for decades to keep that door sealed, pretty much forever. Brian then looked around the room. I have a bad feeling in here. He's getting one of the managers to get a hold of the people who sealed the door before. I don't know if it's some religious thing or, well, whatever it is. Hopefully... We were interrupted by a tall, well-dressed man in a side office calling Brian's name. That must be him, Brian said, quickly turning away. Right in here, sir. The man gestured to the inside of the office with a friendly smile and a nod. Then Brian disappeared inside. I scanned the room again, checking everyone out. Something wasn't sitting right. I then looked back at the door Brian had just entered. The guy was still standing there smiling and just staring at me. Hairs all over my body stood on end. His mouth grew wider and his eyes flashed a bright yellow as he turned and darted into the office, slamming the door behind him. Part 4. I dashed for the office door and grabbed at the handle. The door rattled in the frame, but it wouldn't budge. Everyone turned to look at the crazy guy screaming and frantically kicking and punching a door. I turned around. Most people looked shocked, others not so much. I felt like I could tell exactly who was real and who was not in that moment. After about 15 seconds, 2 heavy-set security officers were bounding towards me. I had nowhere to run. I didn't know what was going to happen. I closed my eyes as they grabbed me, the darkest of thoughts crossing my mind as I felt my feet dragging along the smooth-tiled floor. Thrown in a heap on the rough ground, I heard cars and people talking. I opened my eyes and was genuinely surprised to find I'd been ejected from the building and told not to come back. I beat my head with my hands. Oh, fuck. I sat on the tarmac, just staring at the door. God, I'm so sorry, Brian, I muttered to myself. I sat there for 10 minutes, trying to calm myself down, just staring at the door. Not a single person went in or came out. I pulled my phone out and called my mum as I grabbed my bike. I stood ready to go while the phone continued to ring. I then tried again and she answered almost immediately. Oh, sorry, I was making tea. Is everything okay? She asked in a frantic voice. No, it's not. I'm coming to get you now. We need to get out of here as soon as possible. Grab anything from Brian's we might need. Food, bottles of water, weapons, anything you can find that might be of any use. I'll be there soon. Cycling on a bike was in no way ideal. We would need to find a car or something. My brakes squealed as I skidded almost into Brian's building. I ran inside to find my mum sitting looking nervous, holding a bag. Everything we need's in here. Where's Brian? She asked, looking behind me and out of the window. Brian disappeared. I think he got caught, I replied, not wanting to say too much. She cupped her hand over her mouth. Oh, God. We really need to go. This place isn't safe anymore. My mum nodded and threw the bag over her back, and we left to get on the bike. I cycled to Sean's house. Seeing his car parked outside gave me some hope. Surely his keys would still be inside. All I'd have to do is just go in. Stay here on the bike. Stay hidden. If you see anyone, don't let them see you. Don't make any noise. I'll be back in 5 minutes. She reluctantly agreed, looking at the ground. I'll be right back, I promise. She looked at me with sad eyes. I then turned and crossed the road, and the wind slapped my face, and clouds began to draw in. Sean's door looked splintered and cracked as if someone had been trying to break it down. It was unlocked, surprisingly. I opened the door and the smell reminded me of somewhere I'd rather be able to forget. Hot, Musty air filled my lungs. Walking quietly down the hall, every noise had me on edge. The hall opened up into the living room at the end, and it appeared to have been completely ransacked. Everything was turned upside down and strewn across the floor. Everything but the small coffee table in the center. I tried to focus in the dim light. There was something on the coffee table. It was Sean's keys. Immediately I felt threatened just by their presence, so perfectly placed in the middle, like they were waiting for me. Something else was happening here. I lightly stepped over the stuff on the floor, looking all around me, waiting for something. I just didn't know what. I picked up the keys, trying to stop them jangling in my hand. I looked all around me again. Still nothing there. Carefully I retraced my steps back to the hallway. The hall seemed darker now. I could barely see the end. I could tell the door was still open. The urge to sprint for it was mounting fast, but I still didn't want to make any noise. Floorboards squeaked under my feet. My heart pounded every time I approached one of the doors leading into the rooms. They were all closed. At any moment I expected one of them to burst open and for me to be dragged inside. But nothing happened. I made it to the door and I left. I then triumphantly walked outside and unlocked the car. Still feeling dubious, I made sure to check everywhere in the car and even under it before waving my mum over. She ditched the bike and climbed in the back seat and lay down with the bag. This all seemed a little, well, too easy. Those keys had been there for a reason. What that reason was, I didn't give a shit. The fact is, I now had a car, and whatever it wanted me to do, if anything, I wasn't doing it. I was going to get my foot down and leave Fort William behind. I then looked up to Sean's window. He was standing there looking out from the room I was in no less than a minute ago, waving at me with an evil-looking grin. I smiled back and threw up my middle finger at him just as I hit the accelerator. "Oh, Danny, watch out!" my mum cried. I slammed on the brakes. Ashwin and Dennis were standing in the middle of the road, only a few feet from the car, laughing. Their jagged facial features contorted and twisted to almost resemble the clown in a way. It was then I noticed they were actually wearing the clown's outfit, and they began taking steps towards us. Their arms and fingers grew longer and more pointed. I pulled the car into reverse and slammed my foot down. In my rear view, I saw my dad. His massive form seemed to have grown out of control now, like he could barely carry himself. He staggered along the road, cracking the asphalt beneath him with each step, the road itself burning and crumbling under him. I stopped the car again. I had enough room to maneuver around the other two, not so much my dad. So I threw it into gear and started screaming along the road. I had the urge to just hit them, but I didn't want to damage the car. Or maybe that's what they wanted. Their smiles growing wider as I approached. The urge was building. Just before I was about to make some Ash and Dennis bolognese, I turned the steering wheel and rounded them without incident. My mum screamed, but we were on our way. The streets were almost empty. There were some normal-looking people around, but not many. Maybe only a few cars and vans. I stopped and took out my phone. I opened maps and found the nearest city was Glasgow, 74 miles away. Well, the plan was, get there, get a hotel, and just try to forget about Fort William. Start again somewhere else. There was nothing I could do anymore. The town seemed to be dead, as if everyone had left, or, well, something worse. "Do you need anything from the back? Anything to eat or drink?" my mum asked from the back seat. "No, I'm too anxious, so we just need to get out of here. We go to Glasgow to stay in a hotel for a couple of nights, and we'll see what happens from there." "Oh, do you mind if I sleep? I'm drained, son," she said with her eyes already closed. "Ah, that's fine. We should be there in a couple of hours," I told her, starting the engine back up. Oh, that feeling of seeing the sign, "You're now leaving Fort William," gave me the shivers. I couldn't look back now. I might be labelled a coward or a bad friend, but there was literally nothing I can do. I can't go and seal the door myself. I can't save anyone now but myself and my mum. The drive was over so fast. No stops, nothing. It was almost 10 p.m. when we pulled into a Premier Inn car park. The city was bright and busy. Hundreds of people just walking around everywhere, not giving one solitary fuck about anyone or anything else. Well, he must have looked like we'd been dragged backwards through hell. We made our way to the reception to check in. The guy at the desk was called Brian. It genuinely crushed me, even just seeing his name, and to think what might have happened to him in that room. "Oh, just 2 rooms, please. Any 2 rooms," I said, and my voice sounded coarse. "Certainly, sir. Do you prefer the rooms near each other?" he replied with a warm, inviting smile. "Just anything. If it's 2 near each other, then yeah, it doesn't really matter." I was trying to be as polite as possible despite how exhausted I was. I needed to get to bed and rest. The receptionist charged my card and promptly handed over 2 key cards and directed us to our rooms. 2 floors up, and both rooms right next to each other. I threw the bag over my shoulder and my mum put her arm around me. She seemed unsteady and also exhausted like myself. We got to her room where I took her in and helped her onto the bed. "Right, get some sleep if you can. We'll figure out what we're going to do tomorrow." She just nodded and lay back with her eyes already closed. I quietly left her room and went to mine. Oh, it was nice and cold, fresh. I turned on the TV, chucked the bag on the floor, and then went straight into the shower. Oh, the water felt amazing. I felt like I'd been running a marathon through mud, and the piping hot shower was relaxing every single muscle in my body. After my shower, I put on some shorts and a t-shirt. I lay back and let out a long overdue exhale. The stress and anxiety drained from my body and mind, and I finally felt like I could breathe normally. I put on the news to see if anything was being reported on, but nothing. I did a Google search, checked Facebook, Twitter. Not a single post or article about Fort William. I can't quite say how I felt about that. Then, listening to BBC News 24, my eyes began feeling heavy. I sank deeper into my pillow. I was on a bike, cycling through the streets of Fort William. An intense feeling of déjà vu overcame me. I saw flashes of images like a strobe effect or possibly even a lightning storm. It was raining. I saw the bell tower. The ground beneath heaved as if it were breathing, and its breathing was in time with my own. I felt drawn to the tower. I saw an image of Liam's emaciated body on the floor of the 5th floor. The door to the bell tower was slamming with force. It broke. The splintered wood got sucked inside and a deafening roar emanated from the building. The bells began to ring. I saw Sean's face grinning from his living room window and waving me off. I saw Sean's car keys on the small square table. Ash and Dennis smashing my dad's car as his dead body lay inside almost torn apart. I cycled on and on. The bells were getting louder and louder as the rain got heavier. I suddenly realized where I was. I was cycling to Brian's house. As his house came into view, Brian's face was pressed against the window. He saw me and waved me over. I saw my mum's head behind him, peeking over his shoulder. She was smiling. Her eyes began to glow like 2 fiery beacons, and black veins became visible on her face. Brian had no idea. The bells rang even louder. My ears could barely withstand the noise. I stopped dead on the bike. The rain poured down my face as I just stared at them. I woke up with a start to knocking on my room door. I was soaked in sweat. The bells were still chiming, and they grew louder as I checked my phone. Midnight. Another knock at the door. "Danny, it's me," my mum called. "Can you hear the bells? Oh, please let me in, Danny. I'm scared." I got out of the bed and hastily walked to the door. I grabbed the door handle and then I stopped myself. I remembered her standing behind Brian with that grotesque face. I looked out of the peephole. She was standing a couple of feet back. Her face was twisted and jagged, and looked like it was melting. She raised her hand and waved with her long, black-pointed fingers, sporting talon-like claws. "There you are." She grinned, her voice getting noticeably deeper. She knew I was looking. I took a step back from the door. Feeling panicked, my breathing rate increased dramatically. The door shook. The ground shook. "Let me in, son. It's time. There's nowhere to run now." Her voice sounded demonic and guttural. I continued walking backwards until I tripped and fell onto the bed. "Oh, the bag," I said to myself, realizing what I'd tripped on, thinking there could be something useful inside. I opened it. It was just packed full of Polaroids. They spilled out all over the floor. Pictures of everyone. Liam, Sean, my parents, Ash, Dennis, Brian. All of them shackled to the beds from that room on the first floor, being tortured and their bodies being ripped to shreds. Pictures of me in various locations within the tower and in the streets. A picture of the keys on Sean's table. The fucking keys. Wanted me to take the keys. I thought I was getting away when all along it wanted me to take it somewhere else. And I've just driven it to the biggest city in Scotland. What have I done? I sat slumped on the floor. There's nowhere to hide now. The door's beginning to break, and it's only a matter of time before it gives way. I can see the cracks appearing all over. If this is the last thing I ever write, then I want this to be a warning to every one of you. Do not ever go to Fort William under any circumstances. For your own sake, stay away. If there's anyone reading this right now, should you ever find yourself in Scotland, I recommend you pay a visit to my hometown of Fort William. If you're interested, we can even arrange to meet up. I have loads to show you. So there you go, my dear friends. That is the third and, as far as I know, the final part of the Bell Tower series. I've certainly really enjoyed reading that. Hope you've been able to put up with my terrible Scottish accents for the characters. I don't know. Been around Scottish people all my life, so hopefully it's not terribly, terribly awful. And it was a lot of fun to play around doing those characters. Awesome story. Had me creeped out every episode all the way through, and I hope it was the same for you. Well, that's the Monday. Back again here on Wednesday with another long story, hopefully. So then, my dear friends, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.
Hello everybody. Before we get to today's story, I wanted to tell you about today's sponsor, Manscaped. Manscaped is the premium brand for men's grooming and hygiene products. If you've normally used standard razors to shave or are paying $40 or $50 for replacement heads on your electric trimmer, Manscaped is a great option to look into. And I would recommend the Lawnmower 4.0. This trimmer has ceramic blades and skin-safe technology. They help reduce nicks and cuts so you can use it on pretty much any part of your body, and they're easily replaceable. It's wireless and you can get up to 90 minutes of use on a full charge. Or you could try out the Ultra Smooth package. This package involves an easy 3-step shaving system. The crop exfoliator, which exfoliates the area and preemptively helps reduce ingrown hairs while shaving. The crop gel, which is applied to prepare for a close shave, and the new crop shaver, which has 3 precision blades with extra wide lubricating strips and a pivoting head for the best shave at any angle. In the Ultra Smooth package, you also get 6 replacement blades for your crop shaver, as well as a convenient storage case for easy travel. And you can get 20% off plus free shipping at Manscaped with code DARK20. I'd like to thank all of you for supporting the channel, and I'd like to thank Manscaped for sponsoring this video. And with that said, enjoy the story. My old Toyota was barely hanging on during my trip to work that day. I probably should have asked around to maybe arrange a carpool, or even just called in sick, but I was hoping it wasn't too far gone. It was approaching the end of the month, and the last thing I needed was to miss a day of work when rent was coming due. Though the job paid pretty well, I still mostly lived paycheck to paycheck. I managed my money well enough, but things weren't always easy for the working man who never managed to achieve any further education after graduating high school. My home life hadn't been the most stable over the years, so I had never been the most attentive student. There were times I never even believed I would see the other side of those times with my sanity intact, but life got considerably easier when I was able to move out of my childhood home. My old beater of a car was struggling like hell when I pulled into the parking lot at my job. I kept my fingers crossed that it would still get me home after my 8-hour shift ended. I had been ignoring the check engine light for a while now, but it hadn't been struggling so much until this Thursday afternoon. I live a good 40 minutes away from my job. The money was decent enough to warrant the commute. Still, I shouldn't have continued to procrastinate in getting my car looked at. It was my lifeline after all. I suppose I was hoping to avoid the likely high cost of whatever repairs it would need, or having to take any time off work to arrange to get it fixed up. So I just continued to cross my fingers and roll the dice. Naturally, of all days for this to happen, my relief called in a little after 10 to let me know he would be a few hours late. Caleb, a friend who works in another department, had already offered to give me a ride home if my car wouldn't crank, since he lives out my way. Unfortunately, Jackson running late guaranteed that my only option would be to put my faith in my ragged old Toyota to get home at 2 in the morning, when my now elongated shift would come to an end. I snuck out to the parking lot to check things out during my break times, but I wasn't the most well-versed in automotive problems. I looked up a few videos to narrow down what could be causing the engine to stall, smoke, and backfire from time to time, but most of my research indicated I would need a replacement part or two, to which I currently had no access to. I told myself that I would not procrastinate any longer on getting someone to look at it if I could just make it home safely that night. As was almost entirely too predictable, Jackson did not stroll in until a little after 3. Yeah, he apologized for the inconvenience, but it felt more of an obligatory statement than a genuine one. Maybe I was just pissy about having to work over, while frustrated about my uncertain trip home so late. Regardless of my irritation with the situation, I was finally ready to approach my near-death sedan and hope for the best. It didn't help my circumstances that it was the middle of November, and the 32-degree temperature and bitter wind were already biting into my skin by the time I reached my vehicle. Between the cold causing my gooseflesh to shiver and the uncertainty of whether or not my car would start, making my back tense up, I was far from a happy camper. My hand was shaking like hell while I attempted to slide my key into the ignition switch, but I finally made contact and gave it a turn. It took a few tries, forcing me to worry I would flood the engine, but before too long, my rust bucket was humming, to which I let out a grateful sigh in return. Hopeful that my journey back home would go smoothly, I took advantage of the deserted roads and pushed my pedal down to make the trip in my iffy vehicle as short as possible. If nothing else, pushing past the speed limit got me a little closer to my destination before the engine let out a loud popping sound, followed by a high-pitched squeal while steam billowed out from under the hood. I'd love to tell you that I handled it with dignity, but that was far from the case. As I guided my deceased piece of shit onto the side of the road, with a complete absence of power pushing the wheels, I yelled out every single variation of swear words that my brain could conjure. I popped the hood, which caused more steam to burst out into the frigid night air. I slipped on my work gloves to be able to flip the latch to release it all the way, but it was hard to see anything through the fog that was erupting from my engine. The cold weather only served to make it even thicker. After feeding the radiator some water, wiggling a couple of hoses, and kicking the shit out of my bumper, leaving a fresh new dent to add to my aggravated state, I gave my ignition another try. It wouldn't even attempt to turn over. I just sat in my driver's seat for a while, thumbing through my contacts in search of anyone who may be up this late, while puffing away on a freshly lit cigarette. I'd never tried Uber or any such services in the past, so I was unsure if they still operated at this hour. Naturally, my service was sketchy in the middle of nowhere that I now sat parked in my broken Toyota. No Wi-Fi, no mobile data, 1 bar of service. Yep, the fates were not in my corner on this bitter, cold night. With a heavy sigh that made my breath mimic the steam that still drifted out from under my now closed hood, I snatched my backpack from the passenger seat and began my long walk home. It was around 4 in the morning. I was still muttering curses under my breath over the first couple of miles of the trip. I had my hands buried in my jacket pockets, and I wished I'd thought to wear something thicker when I headed out to work some 12 hours ago. I stopped for a moment to light another cigarette while checking on my phone to see if my access to the internet had returned yet. Of course not, I said to myself with another sigh. My feet were already throbbing. I stretched my back out, causing a series of cracks and pops to echo from the lower half of my spine. I looked around at the empty road, feeling like it appeared far less familiar than the one I had traversed twice a day for the last few years. There were woods on either side of me, which I always knew to be there, but they still looked almost foreign to me. Perhaps they just seemed different because I stood in place, as opposed to the 60 miles per hour I would normally be speeding past them at. Maybe I just hadn't paid much attention to them before. It was still a strange sensation, to be honest. Everything felt a little off somehow. The air was cold, but the wind did not appear to be moving much. It didn't smell like frosty grass and leaves. Maybe it had just been some time since I last took the time to appreciate such scents. It was almost as if the oxygen I breathed tasted used in some way, if that makes any sort of sense. The world around me was almost completely silent, while I sat on the curb, taking a deep drag on my smoke while allowing my exhausted feet to stop throbbing for a moment or two. The trees on either side of the road appeared to harbor no life. No rustling, no crickets chirping, nothing. It could be that many forest creatures were hibernating or otherwise at rest. Again, something I never paid much attention to before. Rarely was I out this late, and this would be the first time I was forced to trudge a good 20 miles back to my home. Before I started moving again, I decided to dig through my bag to find my earbuds. Perhaps some music would make the time pass by at a quicker pace. I tapped shuffle on my downloaded songs and began walking. Maybe 45 minutes after my trip resumed, I decided to give my phone an obligatory glance to check the time. 4:30, I exclaimed to the deserted highway. I was sure I had been walking for at least an hour before I stopped the first time. There was no way I'd only been traveling for half that. I glanced around to see nothing more than trees and the empty road. There was nothing that could differentiate where I started from where I now stood, aside from the ragged rust bucket I'd left in the breakdown lane many miles back. Part of me almost wanted to travel back to where I had come from, but I didn't want this trip to take even longer. Surely my phone was just glitching from the cold. Maybe service was just so bad out here that I wasn't able to get a solid reading of the time. That made sense, I guess. It was a reasonable enough theory, anyway. Far more sensible logic than the last couple of hours of walking, only actually being a quarter of that time. Once again, I began my saunter with a freshly lit cigarette and some new music. The chilly air was still biting into my skin, and now my shoulders were so tensed up that I may well have left the coat hanger in my jacket when I threw it on before leaving my job in the dust. Every few minutes, I glanced back at my phone to see the time remained unchanged. I kept going, regardless of the unmoving digits on my screen, assuming that this only proves my theory that it was nothing more than a technical issue. I continued to glare at the phone until another minute finally passed by on its face, which felt like it took a good quarter of an hour to my internal clock. After many more miles, and only a handful of minutes having supposedly passed by, I knew that the sun should have risen by this point. According to my mental chronometer, it should be creeping up on 7, though my phone insisted it was only a little after 5. I was sure that dawn had to be just around the corner, but I couldn't see the slightest indication that the sun would be rising anytime soon. It did not surprise me to see my phone's low battery light flashing either. I was growing steadily more skeptical about the possibility of ever getting back to my home when the road finally showed me signs of life beyond my own. The world was so dark around me that the headlights approaching from my rear practically lit up the entire highway. I turned to face the vehicle that sped in my direction and extended my thumb out to the side. I could only hope this lone traveler would take pity on me. I may have been seeing things, but as the car drew closer, it looked as though it was bellowing almost as much steam as my own had been before it sputtered out. Still, I maintained my outstretched, pleading thumb and hoped to God they would pull over. As the long and wide 70s model Lincoln slowed down and drifted over the curb where I stood, I practically leapt for joy in the back of my mind. I stashed my phone and earbuds into my jacket pocket and jogged over to meet the veritable land yacht that appeared to shudder wildly as it idled, had a transparent tarp in place of the absent glass, and the faded green paint was chipped and speckled with splotches of rust, but I was still excited to have a ride nonetheless. "Oh, thank you so much," I exclaimed after pulling the door open to allow a cloud of cigarette smoke to erupt from inside. As soon as I got the words out of my mouth, a foul smell leaked from within. It almost made me think of moldy bread dipped in spoiled milk. The seats were covered by large sweatshirts that appeared to represent one football team or another. They were a similar green to the exterior and had what almost looked to be numbers sewn into them in large white patches, stained with yellow and brown splotches. They were more like symbols than actual numbers, though. Perhaps the shirts represented a foreign team, bearing less recognizable numerology. The woman at the steering wheel didn't so much as glance in my direction when I slid into the vehicle and closed the door. She was incredibly thin, with heavily wrinkled and darkly tanned skin. It looked far from a natural tan. She appeared as though she had seen the wrong end of many hard drugs in her time. Her knotted hair had a faded purple dye job, dark roots with streams of gray and white running through it. She wore a faded blue and pink flowered dress that revealed her bony and weathered arms. As soon as I snapped the seatbelt latch, she hit the gas without a word. Though the interior of the car was quite massive, I had little legroom as my seat was pushed up close to the glove compartment. Choosing not to take a glance in my gift horse's mouth, I thought it was best to not push my luck by adjusting the seat. It was quite awkward to be sharing a car with someone who wouldn't so much as acknowledge me, but the fact we were moving considerably faster than the couple miles per hour I may have previously been going made it easy to tolerate a bit of discomfort. "I really can't thank you enough for picking me up," I offered in an attempt to ease the tension.
Ain't nothing.
She spoke in a graveled and worn voice. "What brings you out this way so late?" I asked, trying my hand at a bit of small talk.
Driving.
I just nodded my head while deciding it may be best to remain silent after all, as the woman to my left reached into the center console and pulled out a pack of Morley cigarettes. I had to double-take at the writing across the wrinkled, soft-shell pack, as it was designed to match the style of Marlboros, which were my go-to brand. I recalled watching several movies over the years whose characters would smoke Morleys, as this would avoid the producers having to pay an actual cigarette company to allow their name to be displayed on film. Could this have been some sort of novelty pack? Was I reading way too much into a simple pack of smokes? Likely so. The woman held the open, crumpled box up to her mouth and pulled a cigarette out with her lips, tracking thick saliva across the other remaining butts in the pack. She offered me one with her outstretched hand while she lit the one in her mouth with the other, letting go of the steering wheel and causing the car to drift quickly to the left. No thanks," I replied to the splayed open pack in her hand, gripping my right hand tightly around the "oh shit" handle above the passenger door.
Suit yourself,
she stated, wrapping her bony fingers around the steering wheel again while taking an unnervingly long, deep drag from her cigarette. I tried to make my glaring eyes as inconspicuous as possible while I watched half of the lit cigarette between the old woman's dried and chapped lips burn about halfway down through that long single drag. The solid inch of cylindrical ash still protruded from the remaining cigarette that still hung out of her mouth, falling to her chest moments later. That was when I noticed the front of her dress was covered in gray, sooty ex-nicotine and paper. I had momentarily been tempted to fish out my own smokes after she offered me one of her spit-moistened ones, but I found my appetite for the habit waning. By the time the woman snuffed out her Morley in the cluttered ashtray before lighting another, it was getting harder and harder to see much of anything through the thick plume of smoke that filled the cabin of the old Lincoln. "Do you mind if I crack the window?" I asked, hoping this request would not offend my chauffeur.
Lever's broke,
she replied, taking another incredibly deep inhale of smoke. The more I heard her speak, though it had only been short replies at most, what I could make out from her accent sounded southern almost, but more like a parody of what some may assume a country accent should sound like, if that makes any sense. It reminded me of an actor putting on a southern drawl for a role, having never actually heard one in person. I continued, hoping I wasn't pushing my luck with the strange old bird.
This'n's broke too,
she said, jiggling the handle for confirmation. "Oh."
You can get out if it's bothering you,
she stated with a shrug. In all honesty, I considered it. We had already been driving for a good 10 minutes or so. Surely I wasn't far off now. Still, the thought of getting back out into the freezing air versus just a little while longer of muffling my coughs and trying my best to avoid breathing in that awful smell would remain an inner debate for a while. "No, it's okay," I replied, still unsure if this was the right call. "I didn't mean any offense. I really do appreciate the ride."
Mm-hmm.
She shook her head from side to side while muttering under her breath. We sat in silence for some time while my driver chain-smoked one after the other. I could hardly breathe after another 10 minutes went by, but I knew we had to be getting closer to my destination. This road was a straight shot to the town I lived in, and my home was only a few minutes past the city limits. Though I couldn't see a damn thing through the smoke that engulfed the speeding car, I was certain I should be within tolerable walking distance of my house by this point. I was beyond ready to get away from the foul stench and breath and into some fresh air. Not to mention, everything felt just a little bit off, from the cigarette pack to the phony accent. Sure, I could be overreacting to easily explainable things, especially with how exhausted both my body and mind had gone, But I wanted nothing more than to get out of this car and away from this woman. "If it's cool, I think this should be close enough," I said, breaking the silence that was almost as suffocating as the thick fog. No reply. I can just get out right here if you don't mind pulling over." Still not a word. "I sincerely can't thank you enough for getting me this far." Was she even still awake? Ma'am?" Nothing. All I could see was the flicker of light when she would take another deep drag off her cigarette. All I could hear was the rumbling of the engine, the tarp flapping in the wind behind me, and the tire's occasional bump over the reflectors in the center line of the road. I waved my hand back and forth in an attempt to clear a line of sight through the cloud. Suddenly, the woman's face emerged through the smog as she let go of the steering wheel and charged toward me. Within a second, her whole body was on top of me in the passenger seat, and her wrinkled and bony fingers wrapped around my wrists, pinning me to the door.
You ain't going nowhere.
Her foul breath hit me like a careening truck. Apparently, that was the very thing that worked its way through the car, though that was only the diluted version. What struck my nose this time was much more intense and stomach-churning. I had to fight against the lump forming in my throat, as well as the considerable strength of the frail old woman.
You had your chance to leave. I didn't have to offer you that,
she said softly. I could feel the car gliding from left to right as we still sped across the deserted road. I had no idea how this was possible, as the foot that was previously on the pedal was now pushing against the dashboard as she continued to scream at my face.
I picked you up. That means I own your ass now.